Good morning. My name is Aaron Fry. I serve as Maine's Attorney General, and it is my sincere privilege to be able to address you all today at the third annual Opioid Response Summit that has been put on by Governor Mills and her administration. It is so important that we have conversations like this now. And I express sincere appreciation for Governor Mills for the leadership in bringing us together, because now, as we emerge from an isolating pandemic where it was so hard to access so many resources, it is important that we figure out a way to rededicate ourselves to the important work that we need to do to make sure that everybody has a pathway to the recovery that they deserve and we want them to have. I'm honored to follow not only Governor Mills and Aaron French, but also Secretary Becerra. For a brief period of time as AG, I had the opportunity to serve with Becerra as a colleague. And I want to highlight that it was so important, the work that he did to defend the Affordable Care Act. It was, frankly, something I was glad to do. I supported his efforts to ensure that the Affordable Care Act remained the law of the land. And it's because there's that access to health insurance, that access to health care, that we are able to ensure that more individuals have a pathway to recovery. Here in Maine alone, we have seen over 100,000 individuals access healthcare through the Affordable Care Act. I appreciated the leadership that Secretary Becerra showed as AG of California, and it's so exciting to see that not only is he in a position to continue that good work, but that he has Maine on his radar as well. I also want to take a moment to say that it is just such a treat and a privilege that I can present to you from the Bangor Area Recovery Network right here in Brewer, Maine. When I was in private practice before I became Attorney General, I served as a defense attorney, and I represented a number of individuals who, when they came into my office, they were at probably one of the lower points that they had experienced. And for me, it was really important to make sure that they had some direction to help get them out of that place, to get to recovery, to get to the point where they could be a good citizen, a good parent. And part of that effort, part of the team that would help many of these individuals was found right here at the Bangor Area Recovery Network. The barn was stable, accessible, doors open to make sure that individuals who are looking for their pathway on how to improve their situation, on how to get to recovery, the barn was there for them, and it continues to be. It is one of these lights that, as best as they could through a very isolating pandemic, made sure to do as best they could to ensure there's access to peer recovery services, to 12-step programs, different social events once the restrictions lifted to allow for different social events. Really important touchstones to so many individuals who are looking for that pathway to recovery and to maintain their recovery. And so it is just such a treat that I can be here today with individuals in my community, because I'm out of Bangor, to share with you in this conference. And I also appreciate that it took a little bit of work to do this, so I imposed and they welcomed me, which is what so many places like the barn are doing now across the state of Maine. It is so important, particularly as we're emerging from the COVID-19 pandemic, that places like the barn are accessible so that people can reconnect, come together, and experience success with their recovery. As we've already heard today from so many, we did have just an awful 2020. As we heard on the national level and certainly in the state level, the COVID-19 pandemic, it enhanced the isolation that individuals were feeling. It reduced the access to so many necessary services to help people on their path to recovery. And then when you combine that with the fact that we were seeing an increase in very lethal drugs coming into Maine, in particular fentanyl, it just created a combination of just hard to address factors, not just for Maine, but across the United States. Dr. Marcella Sorg, who is a forensic anthropologist out of the Margaret Chase Smith Center up at the University of Maine in Orono, she works with the Attorney General's office to provide a drug death report. This was an initiative that started when Governor Mills was the Attorney General, and it's been, my pleasure to continue with that. That annual report and quarterly reports that go along with it provide so much important information about the different characteristics of what we're experiencing in Maine when it comes to those who are losing the battle to their addiction, who are succumbing to a fatal drug overdose. We've already heard the numbers for 2020. Let me add some information to that. 83% of those fatal overdoses were a result of non-pharmaceutical opioids, particularly fentanyl, which continues to be the main cause of these lethal overdoses. 91% of these were accidental. And there's so many more statistics that are available that I ask you to all access. Go to the Office of the Attorney General website. Go to mainedrugdata.org. I'm going to say that page a little bit again later, mainedrugdata.org, where you can see different pieces of information about what it is that we're seeing relating to, what it is that people are experiencing when it comes to overdoses, so that you can use this in your daily lives to support your family, your friends, those who we all want to help make sure they have a path to recovery. I also want to add that because it's so important to have access to real-time information, the annual report that my office was putting out, 2, 3, 4 months after the information came in, it's a little bit stale and did not allow for immediate access. So in working with Director Gordon Smith and working with the administration and working with the Office of Behavioral Health, we are now putting out more real-time information on a monthly basis as to what we're seeing in trends, not just for fatal overdoses, but for non-fatal overdoses as well, which is new information that's important for us to understand, because it reiterates just how important it is to ensure that there's access to naloxone, that there's access to support networks, that we have family and friends who are making sure to be available for those who may be at a low point in their addiction and their path to recovery. And so what we're seeing is that from January to May, which is the information that we presently have, we did see very, very sadly and very tragically, 245 fatal overdoses. At the same time, we saw 2,975 reported non-fatal overdoses, which means these are individuals who were saved with reversal. There was somebody who was there to support and help them and get them through that event. And that's important to know, because the more people we can get thinking about these numbers, thinking about how they can be that person to support that individual who may be at a point where they need somebody to give them that helping hand to dispense that important reversal drug. This data is really important, particularly when you consider the other metrics that this reporting would provide, and it's in more real time. So I want to drive you again to a particular website. That's mainedrugdata.org. It has a lot of information that, frankly, is going to be so important in how it is we're able to make sure people have a pathway to recovery, and that we can all be teammates, partners, supporters, so that everybody has that pathway. I want to look ahead a little bit and talk a little bit about what my office hopes to be able to work with Governor Mills, Director Smith, and you on in order to address the opioid epidemic here in Maine. First, legislation that was drafted by Governor Mills and Director Smith, introduced by Dr. Richard Evans, who's a representative out of Dover-Foxcroft. The governor signed into law an accidental drug overdose review panel. This is a group of stakeholders that is going to be coming together to look specifically at overdoses in Maine, in what it is that we can learn from them, so that we can make targeted plans on how we can better address some of the different moving pieces that are contributing to the persistence of the opioid epidemic here in Maine. This is something that has seen some success in other states, and it's meaningful that the legislature, the governor, passed that into law, so that'll be, in fact, it's being set up, now. Through my office, we're going to continue to litigate against those different manufacturers, distributors, those whose activities caused, contributed, exacerbated the opioid epidemic. As many of you have probably already heard, my office had been successful in securing at least one settlement against McKinsey, which is a firm that worked with Purdue and the Sackler family to drive and push and increase the use of their very deadly drugs. We got a settlement and some resources coming in for abatement from them. We're on the verge of closing a settlement against Purdue. Purdue, as many of you know, is one of the main companies that drove the opioid epidemic. Very problematic. The Sackler family, frankly, just reprehensible the way in which they pushed their drug without any regard for the consequences that it was going to cause here in Maine and across the United States. This settlement doesn't bring the kind of punishment or bringing to responsibility that we all believe they should deserve. But absent being able to turn back time and lock them away, what we need to do is get money from them directed into the state so that we can abate this crisis now. That settlement is in process and should be closed out soon. And my office continues to work both here in the state and with our partners and AG's offices across the United States, Republicans and Democrats, to hold other manufacturers and distributors responsible. These resources are going to be directed by a range of stakeholders. And so folks from government, state, county, municipal, from supporting groups, from advocates, law enforcement, everybody who has a voice that needs to be heard as to how these resources are going to best abate the crisis are going to be part of that conversation. And then, of course, my office continues to work with law enforcement to disrupt the flow of some of these very deadly drugs. As I mentioned, fentanyl continues to be the driving drug that leads to fatal overdoses here in Maine. We're going to continue to work really hard to interdict and disrupt that flow, giving Mainers who are struggling with their substance use disorder a chance. And then finally, an initiative that was started by Governor Mills when she was AG, that I continue. We do continue from my office provide naloxone to law enforcement agencies across the state. As of yesterday, it's my understanding that since this program started, the small amount that we're able to put out has led to at least 1,340 reversals. That seems like a small number, but when you add that with all of the other work that folks like you, folks across Maine are doing to be that resource for somebody who may be working through their drug addiction, who needs somebody there to provide that reversal. This number is important because it shows that every little bit helps. And so I want to express my appreciation for the significant work that I know you are all doing, that I know today it's rededicating us to, and that you're going to continue to do. Family, friends, treatment providers, social networks, my appreciation for the work that we're going to be able to do together is very high. And I'm looking forward to continuing to work with Governor Mills, Director Smith, all of you to confront, root out the opioid crisis here in Maine. And I just want to close by saying this really has been a treat that I can present to you from the Bangor Area Recovery Network. I want to encourage all of you, when you get done today, to find your way to your local network, whether it be the Barn or one of the other 13, 14 recovery centers across the state, because it's so important that we get out from the pandemic and start to interrelate with each other again, because that is how, working together, that is how we're going to confront and successfully deal with the opioid epidemic. My thanks for being able to speak with you today, and I look forward to working with you very much.
I wasn't comfortable with myself from a very young age. And I grew up in a good family with loving parents. I think it's kind of a misconception that we all come from broken homes. Neither of my parents used substances in any shape or form. But I did at a certain point in my life. I think that the thing I found was my first experiences with using substances was the first time I really felt comfortable. I really felt at ease with myself. I was able to do things I saw other people doing, like, talk to girls and socialize with people and fit in. Something I had never had. So I really, of course, hooked into that. Like, we all crave that connection. We all crave to belong, and feel love from others and give love to other people. So it played, in my young life, it played a huge role. Using substances was my go-to in any given situation, really. And I didn't see, very early on how that could develop into such a problem. I caused a lot of damage in my active use. I got in trouble with the law. I damaged relationships in my family and in my social life, and really got to a place where, fast forwarding a little bit, I was living a life that really nobody should have to live. It was in isolation, was nearly unemployable, couldn't hold a job down, because of my use, and just had become kind of a prisoner of, needing substances just to get out of bed in the morning, just to get through one more day. It wasn't fun anymore, and I couldn't remember when it ever was, and that was the odd thing, is I really could think back and not recall why I was doing what I was doing anymore. I just knew that I had to do it. In the midst of all this chaos somewhere, I ended up coming up to Bangor and to visit with my sister. She kind of dragged me up here, I should say. And I ended up, at the local recovery community center, which was the Bangor Area Recovery Network, or the Barn. And, for the first time, felt something ignite in me. I was accepted by the people in the room. They loved me, even though I really didn't know how to love myself. And things took off from there. I got involved. I always say there were so many elements that supported my recovery, but the key role that the center played, was I felt I had community, and I had a home. I had purpose. I started volunteering. I got involved here. I actually eventually ended up working here, piloted a program here. And I wouldn't trade my life for anything today. I kind of equate it to this simple thing that I tell people. Somebody asked me recently, they said, well, Bob, how did you become the executive director of the Barn? And I thought about it, and I said, I was coming here just trying to stay clean for one more day, and I was sitting in the center, and the volunteer coordinator at the time, they were hanging decorations, and she came over to me and she said, Bob, would you like to help us? And that's what I'm doing now. I want to help, and I do that to the best of my ability, and I've never really looked back since that day. And the gifts of recovery just keep coming for me.
Good morning, and welcome to live stream 2, Governor Mills Opioid Response Summit. My name is Richard Gordon. I'm the coordinator of specialty dockets for the Maine Administrative Office of the Court, in other words, the State Drug Court Coordinator. Drug courts, now referred to as treatment courts or treatment recovery courts. Drug courts, now referred to as treatment courts or treatment and recovery courts, are the most researched and proven effective means to reducing recidivism in the criminal justice field. We're very pleased and proud to present an overview of Maine treatment courts, their impact on recidivism and cost savings, We'll also be hearing from a graduate of one of our courts. At this time, it's an honor to introduce the Honorable David Mitchell, Chair of the Maine Treatment Court Steering Committee and presiding judge for the Washington County Adult Drug Treatment Court. Judge Mitchell.
Thank you, Richard. Good morning to you folks. I want to welcome you to the third annual Governor Summit on Opioid issues. We had an invite here 2 years ago. And at that time, we did a more detailed presentation of the treatment courts here in Maine. We spoke about the history of the treatment courts nationwide and in Maine when we did our presentation 2 years ago. And really the historical message at that time, well supported by the data, was then and remains today, essentially that nationally, unfortunately, 65% of folks that are in prison have some sort of substance use disorder or mental health disorder. And more significantly, $80 billion is spent annually on incarceration. And still, despite that amount of money being spent, still prisons do not prevent rearrest and reconviction to any meaningful degree. And that's a problem, and it has been a problem. So Maya Angelou, the great American poet and essayist, is quoted as having said, do the best that you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. The overall message today really is, and again, that this message is well supported by the evidence and the data, is that the Maine treatment courts significantly reduce recidivism. They effectively protect public safety, and they also save money and lives. And you're going to hear more about the actual data when I'm finished. I want to answer the question of who we are. The treatment courts in Maine are specialty courts. We seek to treat those in the criminal justice system who have substance use disorders and or mental health disorders and who are considered high risk and high need. Richard has a slide that'll show you where in Maine the courts are located. I'm not going to read that for you. You can look at that yourselves. I will add that there's efforts being undertaken to expand the treatment courts into 2 additional counties, one in Oxford and another one down in the mid-coast, most likely in Rockland, because that's centrally located to the 3 counties down in the mid-coast area. Applicants can be presented. They can make application to the program either through their attorney or their probation officer. In some instances, the case managers are into the jails and catch wind of folks that might be in need. They might initiate those types of discussions, and a referral can be made in that fashion as well. Once the referral is made, the case manager and the treatment provider each administer some evidence-based assessments that are designed to identify their level of care and also their level of risk and need. And then we get to the task of letting their attorney know, and then also the courts made aware, and other members on the team. The defense attorney, assuming that the person is found appropriate for the program and not charged with a crime that would be an excludable offense, the defense counsel and the district attorney's office would strike up a plea negotiation and hopefully reach an agreement on both a good result, that is the result that would flow from a successful completion, and then also a bad result, if you will, in case the person is not successful during his or her participation in the treatment court. Once they're admitted, of course, handcuffs really are delayed and exchanged for a helping hand. And once they're admitted, they're offered plenty of assistance along the way in an effort to change their habits. Once they're in the program, they have some pretty hefty lifting to do in terms of obligations. They're required to abide by curfews. They're required to attend treatment weekly. They, depending on their level of care, must attend so many self-help meetings per week. They're also required to report to the case manager weekly. They're required to submit to random observed drug tests regularly. And they're required to attend court when those sessions are held. Those sessions are held mostly bi-weekly, and some courts hold them weekly. But they're required to attend to all those things, as well as being employed or in school or participating in community service on a regular basis. And the case manager tracks all their progress and commitments. There's 5 phases in the program. The first phase is 30 days. Each additional phase is 90 days. And so the minimum amount of time that folks would be in our program in order to successfully complete it would be 390 days. After that, the average time that folks are in our program is just shy, I understand, of 18 months, because any time that they do not comply with their requirements, it's going to extend the time within which they're in any given phase. And sometimes people have slips. Treatment plans are tweaked in order to make adjustments and better serve them. So most people are in longer than the minimum period of time in order to graduate. The next question is, how do we do what we do? The power of threes is big, in my opinion. We collaborate, we commit, and we do this with compassion. The collaboration, it's a team effort. We have the treatment courts really use a non-adversarial approach in a team setting to provide access to a continuum of treatment and services to rehabilitate and to treat. In short, the people work together. The team members, there's a slide on who the team members consist of, and we bring together different folks from different areas of the criminal justice system to work together in an adversarial system, but work in a non-adversarial way. And each brings to the table their respective strengths. And as in any team setting, those team members are responsible for compensating for other folks' weaknesses. And so we operating on the assumption that we really, in the team setting, nobody knows more, they just know different things. And so together we can develop a plan for these folks that holds them accountable and gets them pointed in the right direction. We have to remember that there's certain components, standards of practice that are based on evidence and propounded by the National Association. Those are the 10 key components. I can tell you that we have to commit to those, and the treatment courts do that. There's day-long trainings devoted to each of the 10 standards of practice and the key components, and we don't have time to get into that today. I understand that Richard might have a link to provide to you at some point today, so you can read up on those. But essentially, no decisions in the court are made without considering those 10 key components, because and if you don't follow those components, then you're not considered a proper treatment court. We approach these folks with some compassion. I think compassion literally means that we suffer together. We have to recognize that the pain and suffering and misfortune that these folks bring with them really is going to become our own if we do not offer them a helping hand. And so really the treatment courts are set out to do that from the outset. We have to ask why we do this. Why in an adversarial system would we bring together folks from different areas of the justice system to work together in order to serve justice-involved individuals? And so it has not been done historically, and historically the criminal justice system has not served those with substance use disorders and mental health problems. But we made that change some time ago, and it's been successful. And the answer really, I'm going to let you draw your own conclusion, because Ms. Hornby and Ms. Jordan are going to present to you some recent findings from an evaluation that was done last year on our treatment courts here in Maine. It assessed the outcome data for the courts in comparison to the comparison group, that is, other individuals involved in our criminal justice system, the same high risk, high need individuals who do not come into our program, but instead go to prison. And it's going to compare the outcome data with respect to those two groups of folks. They'll present information on that, and you can draw your own conclusion. We think the answer as to why we do it is easy, because the data speaks for itself. After you've heard from Ann and Helene, and really because the real power of what we do is in the stories of the individuals, and not merely in the raw data and the numbers. We'll hear from Katie McKay. She's on the platform. She's a graduate of the Penobscot County Treatment Court. And we keep in mind that the data that we have, the evidence-based data, teaches us to, as Ms. Angelou says, know better so we can do better. But the stories, those like Katie McKay, the stories, the success stories, the stories of those who devote themselves to recovery and do the really, really hard work needed to be and remain in recovery, those stories are what compel us to do better and inspire us to do exactly that. So I want to pass on to, I think, Ms. Jordan is next. Is that right, Ann?
That's correct. Good morning, everyone. I'm Ann Jordan. I'm the manager of criminal process and specialty dockets for the Administrative Office of the Courts. As Judge Mitchell mentioned, our treatment courts serve high-risk, high-needs individuals. In calendar year 2019, we served a total of 295 individuals, 70% of which had felony convictions. We do this because we know that simply locking somebody up and throwing away the key or just putting them in there for a while doesn't do this, doesn't serve the people we need. As was recently announced in the Washington Post yesterday, 93,000 people died of ODs in the US in calendar year 2020. Our clients have a long history of addiction. 82% of the females in our courts are between 20 and 39 years of age. 77% of the males are between 20 and 30 years of age. We embarked upon an extensive evaluation of our adult drug courts in January of 2020. Had no idea that the COVID epidemic was going to send us for a loop. But in any event, Helene Hornby and her company, the Public Consulting Group, embarked upon a 1-year-long intensive data and interview study of our courts. We know that our treatment courts enhance public safety and improve lives at no additional cost to taxpayers. In fact, they save money. How do we know that? Well, Helene and her group looked at recidivism. She also selected a comparison group of people of similar age, gender, race, military service, criminal history, and class of offense, and drawing from data from the MEJA system, which is the court's criminal record system or court's record system. They looked at over 1,600 people between the two groups and did comparisons. They also looked at records from DTICS and the EIS system, which is our individual drug court record system, from CHORUS, which is the Maine Department of Corrections record system, from the record system maintained by the Maine Pretrial Services Group, and from the record system of the Maine Medical Examiner's Office. We found that slightly more than half of our enrollees graduate from the treatment.
You're muted, Ann.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I apologize, folks. It was working and then it just shut out on me. So slightly half of our enrollees graduate from the treatment court program. As Judge Mitchell said, 17.8% is the average time to completion. Our graduation rates range from 42% in Androscoggin County to 60% in the Veterans Treatment Court. Those who don't graduate spend on an average of 12.6 months in the program. You may wonder, why is that important? Well, we can tell you that post-program arrest and conviction recidivism is far lower for all participants, whether or not they graduated. We did a study of the arrest, recidivism, of treatment and comparison groups after release, covering the years 2016 to 2019. After 24 months, the arrest recidivism rate for treatment court participants was 19%. The comparison group recidivism arrest rate was 45%. Over the course of 6 months, 12 months, 18 and 24, the drug court participants had a much lower and significantly, statistically significant lower rate of rearrest than the comparison group. In many of the situations, it was less than half of the comparison group. We also looked at the conviction recidivism for treatment and comparison groups. Again, for the same time frame. After 24 months, persons in the adult drug treatment court had a conviction rate of 6% compared to 41% of the comparison group. You should be aware that these slides will all be made available to you, including direct references to the evaluation report that was published and is also available on the judicial branch's website. Even for those who were withdrawn or expelled, the conviction recidivism rate after release is lower. And when we compare it to the comparison group, again, even for those expelled after 24 months, 6% of our persons were either expelled or withdrew at a conviction recidivism rate compared to 41% of those persons who were in the comparison group. We also looked at persons who had been convicted in the comparison group before the start of their study, and then looked at the comparison going forward. And it shows that those individuals had a much higher rate of returning to prison, returning to jail, or being put on probation compared to the persons in our drug courts. How do we know this? We know this from intensive data analysis. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Elaine Hornby to discuss the issues of mortality and other issues that was looked at in the report. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Good to see you. One of the things that we looked at besides the recidivism rates was the actual mortality rates, whether participating in the treatment court produced fewer mortalities than the comparison group. We found that there were fewer mortalities, although the difference wasn't statistically significant. But over a 4-year period, about 2% of the treatment group died from a fatal overdose versus 2.5% of the comparison group. So it was an improvement, but it wasn't quite at a level of significance, and we're hoping that that will improve over time. The next thing we want to talk about is how we know these courts are effective from the perspective of participants. We interviewed about 40 or 50 people who were either in the treatment courts or had already graduated from the treatment courts. And you're going to get this firsthand perspective from one of those people, Katie McKay, in a few minutes. But I just wanted to give you a few of the quotes from these interviews that were so meaningful. The two big things that we got out of talking to participants was both the emotional and the tangible support that the treatment courts afforded people. And a very typical kind of quote was someone saying, "I gave up on myself, but the treatment team did not give up on me." We've all heard that and know that relapse is a frequent part of this, but if people can come forward and honestly and admit that they've had a problem, and the team will not give up on them. If they show up in court, the team will continue, and that was certainly recognized. Another quote that I like is that the judge gets to know you. He's stern, he or she is stern, but understanding, and reinforces how proud he is. He sees your progress and is respectful. And that is one of the key elements of the treatment court, is the interaction between the participant and the judge, usually around every 2 weeks on a one-to-one basis. So you have a direct relationship and an ongoing relationship for about 1.5 years with the judge. Another thing they said is they do everything they can to help. And this includes both the emotional side, as I mentioned, but also the tangible side, which is once you're into treatment, helping to assess your job skills, needs, your housing needs, your job training needs, and helping with all of those things. So the tangible support really helps people get back on their feet. The next thing I would like to talk about is the cost effectiveness. Ann Jordan mentioned, and Judge Mitchell mentioned, that we were able to actually look into how much treatment courts cost and how that relates to what normal prison time costs. And we divided the treatment costs into the case management, because there are Maine pretrial services and others provide the case management. There's the treatment costs themselves, which is the alcohol and drug treatment. And then there's extrajudicial time, because the judges spend more time. We found that the average cost per person was $10,964 for those three elements: the case management, the treatment, and the judicial. And that's over the year and a half that they're generally in the court. In addition to that, people in the treatment court also experience jail, prison, and probation. And the reason for that is some of it is before they actually start the program, but it's mainly, Ann mentioned that 50 to 60% graduate. So the other people who don't graduate still have to return to jail, prison, or probation. And we calculate the cost of that, which was $27,229 for the treatment group. So that's a total of $38,000. Whereas the comparison group time in jail, prison, and probation was $43,461. So right from day one, there's a 12% reduction in the cost between the treatment and the comparison group. But as time goes on, with the 6 months, 12 months, and 18 months recidivism rates being so much higher for the comparison group, by 18 months, there's a 28% lower cost for people in the treatment court. And that's because the initial cost is lower, but they also have a lower recidivism rate, so we don't see them coming back. So it's significant that it's 28% reduction. And it's all spelled out in the report. I think my time is almost up. So I'm going to just mention one or two other things. We want to try to increase the acceptance rate of people coming into court. About 46% of the people who don't accept treatment court, it's because the person themselves doesn't want to enter the court. And I'm hoping through the people on this line with the recovery courts, the recovery peer support and recovery groups can help get the word out that these courts are effective and people really do get the help they need. And we want to try to lower the number of people who refuse to actually take the treatment court and rather go to jail or prison, because they are very useful. And part of our mission is to get out the word how effective they are. And at that, I'm going to let Katie McKay take over. She's a treatment court graduate from Penobscot. On August 5th of this next month, it will be 1 year since she graduated. So we're all so happy for her. And she's going to tell you a little bit about her experience.
Thank you very much. Good morning. It is truly an honor to be here today. I'm a person who struggled with addiction since the age of 11. When I was younger, I didn't think that I had a problem. I was just having fun, but as I got older, my life began spiraling out of control. I was watching it unfold before me, and I couldn't do anything to stop it. Addiction had a firm grip. My family tried many times, including tough love and cutting me off, but it didn't matter. In May of 2018, I was arrested for the first time. My charge was unlawful manufacturing of methamphetamine, a Class B felony. I begged and manipulated my father to bail me out, which he did 4 days later. This wasn't enough to stop me from using. At this point, I'd lost my children, my home, my car. I'd overdosed numerous times, and I'd lost all respect for myself. Everything revolved around substances. I just kept going in the same cycle. As I look back today, it was the true definition of insanity. Excuse me. Between May of 2018 and January of 2019, I was arrested 3 more times. On January 9th, 2019, I stood in front of the Penobscot County Adult Drug Treatment Court team, other participants, and Judge Budd for induction. I was more scared than I'd ever been. My lawyer and case manager had talked to me about what drug court meant and the responsibilities that it entailed, but I couldn't remember anything that they had said. I just knew that I didn't want to live the way I'd been living any longer. And if I did, I was going to die. The next day, I started an intensive outpatient program, which was 3 days a week for 3 hours at a time. I would go to court once every 2 weeks on Wednesday. I had a curfew for the first time in my entire life. I needed to attend 12-step meetings, call into my case manager every single morning between 7 and 8 a.m., 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And if my color was called, I'd have to show up for testing between 8 and 9 a.m., Plus, I had to stay clean while being held accountable for my actions, and I had to be honest. How in the world was I going to do all of this? I tried so very hard to do things my own way, break any and every rule I could, but it didn't work out well for me. I broke my curfew and I was bail checked. I wasn't where I was supposed to be, and my actions put me in jail for 26 days. They called this a sanction. That was the longest I'd ever been incarcerated. Excuse me. They were trying to send me a message. I definitely received that. When I started drug court, I thought of everyone on the team as my enemy, when at the end of the day, they only wanted what was best for me and to see me succeed. They saw the potential in me that I couldn't see yet. It was a slow process, but I started to get the hang of things. It took me 5 months before I was able to move on from phase 1, but I did. I just kept trying to do the next right thing, and there was days the only thing I accomplished was not picking up a substance. On the days I was struggling hard, I would sit at my case manager's office for the entire day because I knew if I left, I was going to get high. She told me that was okay. I could sit there as long as I needed. She would rather have me where I was safe and alive. After 7 months, while in phase 2, I completed IOP and moved into a program called MRT, which is to change the criminal way of thinking that I had done for much of my life and to start owning some of the wreckage of my past. In phase 3, I was encouraged to get a job, which I did. After starting that job, I got my first apartment. It was my own place for the first time in my entire life, but I had to get the team's approval, of course. Officer Blanchard, who was on the team, was frequently stopping in to check on me. This was one of the most uncomfortable parts in the beginning. In my head, he was just there to catch me doing something I shouldn't have been, but he was really there to show compassion and understanding. I can really thank him for the way of changing the way I think about law enforcement. The day that made the largest impact was Christmas Eve of 2019, the 2nd anniversary of my mom's passing. Officer Blanchard took the time to stop over just to check in and see if he could be of extra support, which was so appreciated, and I don't even think today he understands the impact it had. At 9 months clean, Hannah, my case manager, and I were talking about how I wanted to see my children. It had been almost 2 years since I had any type of contact with either of them. I was so scared to take that step for the fear of them not wanting to see me, but Hannah encouraged me and explained how to fill out the court paperwork to begin reunification with my then 15-year-old son. 2 weeks after filing the documents with the courts, I received a letter from my brother and sister-in-law stating they were also ready to begin the process and suggested we start immediately. They had heard how well I was doing, and they were proud of me. The first place I went was Hannah's office, where Officer Blanchard happened to be that day, and they shared the excitement with me. Zachary moved home 3 weeks after I celebrated 1 year clean while I was in phase 4. In June of 2020, I was offered an amazing position with Eastern Maine Development Corporation as a peer connector, a person with lived opioid use disorder. I never thought I could have a job like this with my criminal history, and the position was just for people in recovery. But they gave me a chance, and I'm so grateful that they did. 1 month before graduation in phase 5, I was able to begin seeing my daughter. Her dad was allowing her to come to my home for visits and encouraging me to repair our relationship. He was proud of me and the changes I was making in my life. The first person I called again was Hannah, and we cried together. She sent an email out to the team, and they all said I'd worked hard to get where I was. I deserved it, and they were proud of me too. 11 months after graduation, I continue to attend court sessions when my schedule allows, and Judge Bud always checks in with me. I talk to Hannah nearly every day. I'm so grateful for every single person on the team, always holding me accountable, standing beside me when I couldn't stand alone, and calling me out when I was acting up. I could never thank them enough for everything they have taught me, letting me have my meltdowns when necessary, and then encouraging me to keep moving forward. Drug Court is truly a remarkable program and changes so many lives and help people create the lives they never dreamed of having. Today, I get to be a mom with both of my children home full time. I'm a partner, a workforce development specialist at Eastern Maine Development Corporation, assisting others, some of whom are in recovery, to try and find their own career paths. I'm a daughter, a granddaughter, a niece, and a positive, productive member of society. I have an apartment and a puppy because for the first time in my 36 years, I'm stable enough to not move 5 times in 1 year, and my landlord tells me that she loves me. I just bought a new car all on my own, and my probation was terminated 4 months early for doing so well and continuing to move forward. My life didn't have to be this way, and my assumption is it wouldn't be, but because of drug court, it is. I used to say this program saved my life, but in all reality, they gave me the tools to build the foundation to save it for myself. And for this, I will always be grateful that they gave this addict a chance. I will close with this, in the words of my children. I had to see my mom sick, but because of the program, I also get to see her get better and show us that it's possible. Thank you.
Richard, do we have any questions? The field?
One of the questions that came in was that in presentations like this, we normally hear from a graduate, but we don't normally hear from someone who didn't graduate. Would you like to address what happens to someone who doesn't graduate?
Is that posed to me?
Yes, Judge.
Well, somebody who doesn't graduate from the program, I mean, I can't always tell you what happens after they're expelled. There's any number of reasons why they would be asked to leave or forced to leave. But I can tell you that the treatment courts in Maine, jail used to be a common sanction. When I was a practitioner and even when I first got on the bench, jail was kind of the go-to sanction that was imposed a couple days over the weekend, and hopefully they'd snap back into compliance. And the pandemic really forced us away from that. The jails were closed. We were then, and we continue to do things on Zoom for the most part, for treatment courts anyway. And so there was no way it was too unsafe to let them drive themselves to the jail. And so we moved away from it. The national standards really push people away from imposing jail sanctions. But if they mess up enough in our program, and you reach a point where the treatment team's putting more effort into their recovery than they are, then the inescapable conclusion is that the program's not right for them, and they're not right for the program. In that instance, they get terminated from the program. Their case, they've already pled guilty or admitted the probation violation, so their case just gets returned to the regular criminal docket, and they go through the process of sentencing. Sometimes people that get kicked out of the program, they have the right to have another judge impose sentence, a judge other than the treatment court judge, because the treatment court judge hears things about these folks on a daily and weekly basis that might impugn the court's ability to be fair and impartial for sentencing. So not all of them exercise that right, but they're given that opportunity. Many are fine with the treatment court judge imposing the sentence, and invariably, oftentimes these folks end up going to prison. Sometimes they get it while they're there, and we don't see them again. But as the data shows, it's likely that they will reoffend and be caught back up into the system. And some of them make reapplication of the program a second time somewhere down the road. So I don't know exactly what happens to them. I hope that they're well. And oftentimes I don't see them unless they make reapplication or they've reoffended and they land themselves in the criminal justice system again. But even for those that are here for at least a year, their outcome data is better than for those who never come into the program. And that data is that evidence is borne out by the data, and it's beneficial to know that. So. Do we have any other questions, Richard?
Yes, Judge. Another question we have is, once you get into a drug court, do you get a whole new caseworker? And perhaps Katie could tell us the process of case managers and other folks that she worked with.
So upon, upon induction, I met with my case manager, who set the rules down, which was a little overwhelming because, we're never made to follow rules. And then we are seeing a treatment provider, and we meet with them every week, sometimes more, depending on our behavior and our needs. I was on bail, but most people have a probation officer. So they meet with him, I think it's once every 2 weeks. And there's just a whole team, and it's not just the people like the case managers. At treatment, I would talk to the secretary there and to speak with her. And I used to be so nervous to go in front of Judge Budd, but in all reality, he remembered stuff that I didn't think that he would ever remember. And it was just touching, the fact that he, always asked about my children once they came home, and he didn't have to, but he did. So there's a whole group, and it's just a really beautiful group. And, sometimes it's hard because they tell you stuff that you don't want to hear, but it's stuff that you need to hear. And for that, I will always be grateful.
Thank you, Katie. You folks should know that if you have a case manager currently from wherever, before you come into the program, you will have the case manager who's a member of the drug court or treatment court team. And you can maintain contact with your other case manager, certainly. But your actual case manager would be the one who's on the team in the treatment court, because you sign releases and information. We have to make sure that people don't triangulate. They tell one person one thing and another person another. And so releases are the way to make sure that that's not happening. So it's fair game for all team members to have discussions with one another in the absence of the applicant or the participant. And so that we can make sure that we know exactly what's going on and how they're playing one off against another. And they do that. They do that early on in the recovery, because part of the addiction process, I think, is just being dishonest with others and dishonest with themselves. We tell them when they come into the program, despite your illness, you have the absolute control over showing up on time and being honest. And though if they can get that down, they'll make progress relatively quickly. And so that's important for them to remember that. Any further questions that we need to field?
We've got another question that's come in that perhaps Ann Jordan can answer for us. Is there any thought to having a juvenile drug court, since the drug courts address 18 and over? And then also, what are some of the barriers to having a drug court in all of the counties?
Maine had a juvenile drug court in Cumberland County a long time ago, which folded primarily because of funding. The standards under the Bureau of Justice Assistance from the US DOJ require that you have certain numbers of individuals in order to apply for a court. As Judge Mitchell mentioned, we have applied for 2 federal grants, one for Oxford County, which will also cover Farmington, and one for the Mid-Coast. Each of those courts for the 3-year period, the costs are close to $3 million each. So the barriers to courts in every county is cost, judicial resources, because a judge who sits on a drug court spends about 20% of their total time each week on the drug court. Ability for funding for defense counsel, ability for the district attorney's offices to provide sufficient staff. Again, that's a funding issue. And we have one county where the prosecutor is not in favor of running a drug court in that particular county. So those are our barriers, or I should say not in favor of running our model of the drug court in that particular county. because we require that all the drug courts follow the evidence-based national best practice standards, the 10 best practice, the standards and everything that comes out of the National Association of Treatment Court Professionals. So those are the barriers. A lot of it is funding, because we need funding for the case managers. We need funding for the treatment courts. We need for the probation officers. We need funding for the prosecutors, defense counsel, and judicial resources.
Time for one other question, perhaps. We've got about 40
All right.
seconds left, I think.
One more question, perhaps this could be addressed by Helene, is it's nice to see the recidivism data, but was that Maine only, or did that include other states or the country?
Recidivism data was Maine only, both the treatment and the comparison groups. But we did look at the national studies to see how Maine compares to other states. And it's similar, or Maine actually had better success than other states when there was a distinction. But that was strictly on Maine. We followed people for 4 years in both the treatment and comparison groups. And the difference in recidivism, frankly, was fairly astounding. It was very, very large difference and very encouraging. And I think if there's a takeaway on the data side, it's that it is successful. The courts are successful in reducing new arrests and new convictions.
I would just like to point out to everybody again, that report is published on the Maine Judicial Branch's website on our drug court tab. And all the statistics are set out in that. And it's an extensive report. It's close to over 80 pages long. Yeah. So it was very, very well done and very extensive.
Okay. Thank you, Ann. Richard, we should maybe attach that link or something to the evaluation as well, if possible.
Yes, sir. We will do that.
All right, great. I think that's probably it. Thank you.
My story, let's see. I grew up in Connecticut with my half-birth sister. We're both adopted from Hanoi, Vietnam. And growing up, I was super insecure and scared. Like, I don't have many memories from my childhood, but a lot of it felt like terror for no significant reason from my upbringing. I had a loving family, and they're still very loving. I came out probably at 14, 15 years old, and I remember I came out to everyone on Facebook via video, because that's what everyone was doing at the time. And then I came out to my family a year later because I was scared of telling them. And I think fear was a feeling I always wanted to escape from. Insecurity, making friends was terrifying. Having people get to know me was terrifying. And for a while, drugs and alcohol, they worked. You know, I felt like I could talk to people. I felt like I could do better in school. I felt like I was prettier. I felt like I was more attractive. And, you know, maybe I was, and it was fun for a while. I mean, it was exciting, you know, and then it wasn't. There were nights where I would take the train back from the city, and I would get in my car and I'd be completely blacked out, and I would come to at the wheel and have those moments where I would pray to something and wish that I would never do that again. And I really believed it at those times. And I would get home, my cat would be waiting for me, would sort of give me a lecture when I would get back home and start meowing back and forth on the couch. And I would look at myself in the mirror and just, yeah, I don't know if I have words for a feeling of it, like maybe self-hatred, loneliness, sadness, just like complete disconnect and disgust for the person I was looking at. I remember every time I would go back into detox or treatment or go back into a meeting, they would ask me like, what happened? do you want to do this again? Have you actually hit rock bottom? And I'm like, yeah, I really want to do this. I want to be sober. I want to be in recovery. And I believed it at the time. And I remember the last time I went out, you know, I didn't really have an answer when I was asked that. I was, all I felt was tired. And at the time I didn't know that that was me like accepting, you know, where I was at, you know, and it was the first time I was able to be honest with people about how scared I have been and how scared I was about, like, I don't know if this is going to work for me. Like, I don't, like, yeah, sure. I want it to work for me. I would love to not do this to my family or to everyone again. You know, like shame was something that I always struggled with. They say like resentment and shame take you back out. And it was something I've grappled with accepting and working on and moving forward towards. You know, I don't think there's one way for recovery to work with someone, abstinence-based or not. For me, that's what's working for me and has been working for me now. And, you know, my recovery looks different than it did a year ago, 2 years ago, X amount of time. You know, and you sort of, you figure things out, and I'm still figuring things out. I mean, there's a lot of firsts in recovery, like my first relationship, my first breakup, my first falling in love, heartbreak, you know, my first time leaving a job before 2 weeks, my first time finishing out those 2 weeks. I don't know, finding new joys. You know, I'm still able to like go out and dance. Like, I love karaoke and I miss it. You know, I have good friends today. I have a dog today who I love. I always thought like I needed to have the answer when I got sober before. You know, that I would feel so secure, I guess, in wanting to be sober. And some days I'm not like that, but I keep trying.
Good morning. I'm Dr. Candace McElroy at Shakopee Valley Health Center, and I'm joined here by Dr. Jean Royer on our screen. Thank you for coming to our session on compassionate opioid tapering, lessons, methods, and resources for deprescribing in the face of the opioid epidemic. The presenters today are myself, Dr. Candace McElroy. I'm the medical director here at Shakopee Valley Health Center. We have a pre-recorded session from Dr. Noah Nelson, who's the medical director of the Schmidt Institute, Dr. Jean Royer, who's one of my colleagues here at the health center, and Gail Johnson, who's also a colleague at the health center, family nurse practitioner with expertise in medication-assisted treatment. I do have a disclosure to share, and that is that my spouse is employed by Takeda Pharmaceutical Company. I personally receive no funding from them, nor do they have any interest in my work as a small town family physician. I did also participate in a grant through HRSA, which I will reference here, that provided some support for the work that you'll see today. The objectives of our presentation today are to identify challenges to tapering chronic opioids in a primary care setting. We're going to review some of the resources available for care teams and for patients during this process, discuss specific steps that we went through in implementing an opioid tapering strategy, and incorporate perspectives from treating substance use disorder into the work that we've done. Finally, I'll be sharing some results of our 2-year opioid tapering program at this rural federally qualified health center. So for background, Shakopee Valley Health Center is a rural federally qualified health center located in western Maine on the New Hampshire border. We serve about 6,000 patients per year, and our services include primary care, walk-in care, mental and behavioral health, medication-assisted treatment, and dental services. In 2019, I came on board at Shakopee Valley Health Center as the medical director and quickly realized that the opioid prescribing in primary care was in excess of what I had been accustomed to. At that time, I had been a physician for more than a decade and had an established practice with a very conservative prescribing approach to controlled medications, particularly opioids. I had first come to Maine in 2011, prior to the 2016 opioid prescribing laws, and before Maine had an active prescription monitoring program. Although I had completed my training at the height of the pharmaceutical companies pushing opioid prescribing on physicians, I had been fortunate to have been in settings in which contact with pharmaceutical representatives was extremely limited, and my attendings and supervising physicians had maintained a healthy skepticism about the paradigm shift that pharmaceutical companies have been pushing about the treatment of chronic pain. That being said, I was trained in the era of pain is the fifth vital sign, and patients may exhibit, quote, pseudo-addiction or behaviors which were not true signs of dependence, but rather inadequate pain control by the part of their physicians. We now know that these terms and concepts were manufactured by pharmaceutical companies to push their agendas and make profits. The pendulum was swinging back around the time that I was establishing myself as a physician in Maine, and as more and more evidence showed that opioids were actually harmful. At the hospital where I was employed, we had a year during which nearly all of our continuing medical education conferences were focused on the opioid crisis and preparations for the implementation of the 2016 opioid prescribing laws in Maine, including opioid tapering, palliative care exemptions, and processes required to adhere to the law. To be honest, after the third or fourth such conference, I felt that it was tedious, and I did not feel that most of it applied to me. I was grateful for a law that supported my practices, and I hoped would displace some of the blame off of the physician when patients were unhappy about not getting the pain medications they sought. I bristled at the concept that physicians were in part responsible for the opioid crisis because I knew that my prescribing practice and most of those that I worked with had been very conservative. There were hints, though, such as when a solo private physician in town retired around the same time that a mid-career physician moved to town and joined my practice. I watched as my colleague inherited patients on high doses of opioids and dangerous combinations with benzodiazepines and struggled with tapering to align them with his established prescribing practices. While I was aware this was playing out, I remained comfortable with my full patient panel and didn't have the capacity or motivation to take on the burden of this often contentious process. All of that changed for me when prescription requests poured in at my new practice at the health center in 2019. While it took me months to figure out the actual magnitude of the problem, at that time we had over 200 patients on chronic opioids with an average daily morphine milligram equivalent of 89, which is just under the palliative care threshold of 90 here in Maine. I was not the only one uncomfortable with the prescribing practices that were in place. In my first few weeks at the health center, I accepted the resignations of a physician assistant and a nurse practitioner, followed by another one, due in part or completely to the prescribing practices that they had to cover. It was clear that we were in the middle of a new crisis and would not have any staff if it continued along that route. I dug into the materials from the CME lecture several years before and had to refresh and update my knowledge. I learned a lot on the job as well, things that I had never encountered in more than 10 years of prescribing medications, such as that methadone has a brand name, and acetaminophen and codeine come in combinations other than 300 milligrams/30 milligrams. I also learned that there was no oversight on the palliative care exemptions despite the Maine law, and that a primary care physician could provide a palliative exemption for a patient on more than 300 morphine milligrams a day of opioid medications for knee and back pain, but yet was still working daily in the construction field. I felt as if I had stepped into an alternate universe, and my heart sank as I realized that prescription opioids from my new health center were, in fact, a major contributor to the opioid crisis in this community. As individual prescribers started tapering medications, often for patients they had not even had the opportunity to meet in person, the need for a structured program around opioid prescribing became clear. Patient complaints poured into the administration, and the physicians, nurse practitioners, and physician assistants felt threatened and bullied by patients. We were now in the middle of a paradigm shift at the health center, one that was not welcomed by a minority, but a very vocal part of our patient population. I reached out to several organizations to bring in education and support, not just for our prescribing clinicians, but also the entire staff, so that they understood what we were doing with opioid tapering and why, especially as many of them live in the community and were privy to the, quote, word on the street about the changes that were happening. Some of the resources that I reached out to included attending the first opioid summit in 2019 that was actually in person in Augusta. At that summit, I met Dr. Noah Nesson for the first time and had the opportunity to hear Sam Canonias speak about his book, Dreamland, which I now have a dog-eared copy of from having read backwards and forwards. We received some education from the Opioid Response Network. I was participating in the HRSA grant that I referenced earlier called the Northern New England Champions Grant, which provided sessions and support for physicians and physician assistants working at federally qualified health centers dealing with opioid issues. We received some free education from the ALOSA Foundation, the Maine Independent Clinical Information Service, and the Schmidt Institute. I'm now going to share Noah Nesson's recorded part, and I'm hoping that I don't have audio issues.
Hi, my name is Noah Nesson. I'm a family doctor and chief medical officer at Penobscot Community Healthcare, and I'm pleased to be able to present to you today. And we are especially pleased at the Schmidt Institute to be collaborating with Shakopee Valley Health Center on their controlled substance stewardship efforts, and with a number of other individuals and practices across the state. We think it's really critical that people understand the principles that drive our interdisciplinary team's review of controlled substance stewardship cases, and therefore you're seeing on the slide before you the 4 explicit principles that we use in conducting these reviews. The cases are reviewed through a business associate agreement or memorandum of understanding that allows us access to the practice's records. They're reviewed by a pharmacist and then de-identified, presented to the interdisciplinary committee where both the patient and prescriber are de-identified. And we do, in that way, do as objective a review as possible and make recommendations, and then follow up on those recommendations at regular intervals to monitor for progress. And we provide data to the practices in order to help them evaluate whether or not this consultation is successful, is helping in reducing opioid burden for their patient population. So these 4 principles are, first, and probably most importantly, that there is no evidence of benefit for opioids in the treatment of chronic pain. And more importantly, or equally as importantly, for the common conditions for which opioids are prescribed chronically, there is evidence of no benefit. So there are studies that show no benefit of opioids for people with chronic back pain, with headaches, with fibromyalgia, neuropathic pain, or chronic regional pain syndrome. And by far, these are the most common reasons that opioids are prescribed on a chronic basis. Number 2, the second principle is that people on daily opioids for chronic pain have a lifetime prevalence of opioid use disorder of up to 35%. The longer somebody is on opioids, the higher doses they are on, the greater their risk for developing an opioid use disorder. This is not a moral judgment. It's part of a differential diagnosis, especially when a tapering is challenging and somebody is suffering more than you might expect from a taper. It's really critically important to consider that diagnosis, to evaluate for that diagnosis, and if it's discovered, to treat for that diagnosis. Otherwise, we put patients at risk unnecessarily. It's not an easy conversation to have with our patients, but one that's really important. Third, that emotional trauma and significant mental illness are much more likely to occur in patients who are on chronic pain, much more likely to be present in patients with chronic pain, and especially those with chronic pain on opioids. We know, for example, that more than half of the opioids prescribed in the United States are prescribed to the 16% of the population who have a diagnosed mental illness. And therefore, it's really important to be aware of that, to make sure those conditions are properly treated, and that we haven't adversely selected people who are most vulnerable to opioids, because people with mental illness are more likely to develop a substance use disorder as well. And so that's an important consideration. And then the 4th principle is that the best approach to the treatment of chronic pain is almost always multifaceted. And that pharmacologic interventions, although helpful, are not usually the most important interventions in the treatment of chronic pain. In fact, insight is the most important treatment. Exercise, weight loss, smoking cessation, physical medicine, lots of other things to be applied in addition to, when it's appropriate, pharmacological interventions as well. And so our approach really covers all of those things. I'm going to go to the next slide here.
And this slide includes the contact information for the Schmidt Institute, which we did start to partner with in the fall of 2019, having them do the patient reviews that Dr. Nesson was referring to. So putting theory into practice, the first thing was to get our administration and board of directors at the health center on board with the idea that we needed an opioid stewardship program internally. The board of directors, when they saw that we were losing nurse practitioners and physician assistants and would not be able to recruit people into a health center that had that kind of prescribing, did agree that we would pass a policy about decreasing opioid prescribing except for palliative care exemptions. We created a registry of patients on chronic opioids so that we would be able to track the progress as we were going along. Internally, we formed a controlled medication review committee that met weekly that included the physicians, the NPs, and the PAs doing prescribing, as well as an RN who had become very involved and helpful in the process. And we implemented this team approach to some very challenging patient situations. I'm now going to turn things over to Dr. Gene Royer, who's going to talk a little bit about the approach that he had to working with patients during this process.
Yes, I wanted to add a note. We've heard from some of the victims of the opioids today, and I wanted to add a note that what it feels like to be in the small room along with these people that have to go through this, a very, very difficult situation. And it's often difficult for the provider too. When I started on this project, I felt like I was in Africa again. I've done work in it. I felt like a mission. I said I was going to lower the opioid level in the community and do a favor, and then also do favor to the individuals. But it's very difficult. You're set in a small room, and these people are very threatened because of the way they have been given medicines in the past. And as any provider knows, oftentimes there's many calls every single day demanding higher levels, or that they have stories like they've lost them, and they line up at the pharmacy and wait. And those are very difficult things to deal with. Also, many times they would call daily, and with verbal abuse, death threats, things like that. And we lost, like Dr. McElroy said, 4 or 5 providers directly because of those types of things. And I personally have been in a room with verbal abuse and other threats, and one guy leans over and pulls his shirt up and his gun's in his belt line, and those types of questions. And so the question is, how do you deal with that? It's always hard. I always was able to back up a little bit with the board directory that said that we were no longer a pain center, never were a pain center, no longer a pain center now, and that we in the process of decreasing and getting rid of the opioids. So that helped me a little bit. The other backup for me was our opioid committee, and I usually said, well, I'm going to be taking your case to the committee, and then we'll see what the committee says. It takes a little bit of pressure off my back sitting in that little room with a threatening situation. And one of the ways to handle it was, as she said, the RN that would take a lot of the calls. She did 2 very important things for me. One was keep track of what all our tapers were doing, because it's very complex and had many of them. And she took the incoming calls from people and then they would do those same things, sometimes be verbally abusive and things, but she would always say, and she was good, she would always say that she could not make that decision because they demand to her that they would be given more at that point. She couldn't do it. So it took the pressure off. And then I also used the recommendations of the Schmidt Institute as a backup. And those are the 3 or 4 things that allowed me to directly face those questions as I talked to the people. And the result of that, personal interactions like that, were often very bad at first, but later on became very positive. Many people were even happy and thanked me for allowing them to get either lower levels or off. And to this now, within the last 6 months, I've had no threats. I've had no intimidating calls. And when I drive into work daily, I'm old enough to retire, but I don't think every single day that I'm going to retire today because I'm going to have to face that. And many times I did in the past.
Thank you, Dr. Royer. So on the screen, I just broke out a few of the different roles that Dr. Royer and our other physician assistants and nurse practitioners played as far as managing the overall trajectory for patients. And then the very important role that our nurse stepped into performing interface with the patients. And you have to have somebody very special in that role. You have to have somebody who can take that unhappiness from patients and not become themselves worked up by that. And she didn't. She was very good at that. Also, she helped to recruit patients for a chronic pain group with one of our therapists. Unfortunately, the first couple sessions of that happened in the winter, early January, February of 2020. And as we all know, that quickly got quashed by the pandemic, but that was a step in the right direction for supporting our patients. Dr. Royer maybe minimized a little bit the burden that he had inherited, but when I did my calculations, he was having to write about 15 controlled prescriptions a day, which for those who write prescriptions, knowing that you have to check data on all of those patients, that's quite onerous. So, next, we're going to talk about how we partnered with Gail Johnson, who was already a resource here, but was able to provide a lot of very valuable insight, especially as we got more into the tapering process and encountered some challenges.
Thanks, Candace. Hello, everybody. I'm going to address the questions that you see on this slide and start by telling you that in 2019, when the Stewardship for Tapering began, I was already working with our medication-assisted treatment program. I was really familiar with working with people who were living with opioid use disorder. I was used to treating people in the withdrawal from opioids, and I also was very familiar with transitioning patients to buprenorphine products. And I understood, just like Dr. Nesson mentioned, that an increasing proportion of people prescribed long-term opioids would likely develop an opioid use disorder. And I also knew that tapering from long-term opioid use would put them at higher risk for that. So my initial role on the team was to help identify and work with those patients who might have developed an opioid use disorder that became apparent in the tapering process. I also had known a number of these patients for many years, and I was in a unique position to observe the effect of the tapering process. And I have to say, it was confusing to me initially. Almost all of the tapering patients seemed to meet a few of the DSM-5 criteria for opioid use disorder. But the patients who had developed dependence on prescription opioids were different than most of the patients that I knew from the MAT program. These tapering patients were already experiencing the negative aspects, some of which Dr. Royer just referred to, of long-term opioid use. That hypersensitivity to emotional distress, which has a new name in the last several years, hyperkataphia, but they were also experiencing hyperalgesia, dysphoria, depression, and of course, physical dependence. And the really difficult part of this for us was that tapering made them feel worse. It did not create a sense of well-being. It certainly didn't cure their hyperalgesia, especially initially. It created just the opposite. And the words dependence and disorder didn't set well with them. And I also think that that framed how we were thinking about this. I noticed as Melissa from the Department of Corrections was talking, she made the point a few times that language really matters. I realized that I didn't really understand what the patient was experiencing. So my role evolved. It began to include learning and teaching about the tapering patient's experience. I had great resources out there with SAMHSA colleagues doing the same work. There's a wealth of work and conversations happening here in Maine. I also found the American Society of Addiction Medicine Pain and Addiction course called Common Threads very helpful in learning the intersections of prescription opioid dependence and opioid use disorder. So we found that understanding the pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics of tapering helped us really understand why this is so hard for patients. It was a really big learning curve for me, and I think for many of us. It was really easy to get focused on morphine equivalencies, drug screens, and the incredibly difficult interactions and sometimes scary interactions with patients and families, patients who felt unwell and discouraged. So as an individual patient was discussed, my role became applying what we had learned about the patient experience to the particular situation. So I'll finish up with a quick summary of what I found really useful. Having a provider and an MAT program involved is really helpful. It's good to have folks who understand how to diagnose opioid use disorder and how to transition people to medication-assisted treatment. But I also think that understanding the patient experience of tapering was equally helpful. We needed a voice that reminded us that language matters, both with each other and with the patient. We also needed a voice to remind us that long-term chronic opioid use had already created a difficult situation for the patient. Patients who are tapering are starting a very difficult and really unexpected physical and emotional journey. And we learned how that is expressed in a patient really varies, but it can never be described as easy. They and we needed to both learn and understand why it was so hard to taper. I think it was also a time for us to be really mindful of practicing consistent professional compassion. And I'll stop there, and I'll obviously be happy to answer more questions as we get to the end of things. Thanks.
Thank you, Gail. So now I'm going to share data that I've been gathering over the last 2 years about our prescription tapering process. So this first graph shows at 6-month intervals how many patients we had in the green bars that were prescribed chronic opioids through our health center. And then the orange line is the total daily morphine milligram equivalents that were being written for these patients. So in January of 2019, which was prior to our start of tapering, there were 211 patients, and folks who were in a position of prescribing at the health center were prescribing more than 18,000 daily morphine milligram equivalents into the community. By January 1st of 2019, the sort of ad hoc individual tapering had started to occur. And by January 1st of 2020, we had more of a systematic approach, which has continued to evolve over the last 2 years, particularly with the piece that Gail just shared with her input. And then I just completed pulling data for our July 1st, 2021, where we're now down to 67 patients that are prescribed chronic opioids. This is inclusive of patients that are in palliative care. And we're now under 2,000 daily morphine milligram equivalents that we're prescribing. The status of patients that are still on chronic opioids at the health center includes now more than half of them, 66%, are in what I call stable. That means their dose hasn't changed between the last 6 months to now. There are some patients, despite evidence that chronic opioids are not indicated. All of us who have been practicing medicine know there is a small percentage of patients for whom they have very few other options for pain, and maybe a low level does allow them to improve their function. This number of patients in that stable orange piece of the pie has gotten a little bit larger each time I pulled this data, because the patients that were easier to taper off have already been tapered off at this point. We still have 18% of our patients that are in a tapering process, 6% that are palliative, and 10% are patients that use it on an as needed basis. I've continued to track those because there are different definitions of as needed in chronic opioids, and I wanted to keep tabs on patients that are still getting a certain percentage of their days out of any month or 6-month period where they have opioids prescribed. One important piece was our figuring out why patients are no longer on opioids. Certainly a concern for any administrator if a program like this goes into place is whether or not they will lose patients to attrition. The majority of our patients who had been prescribed chronic opioids back in 2019 and are no longer on them were actually tapered off, just over half, 52%. And only 14% of those patients completely transferred their care from our health center. Now, that number might be a little bit higher because some of these patients that in that 8% orange slice of the pie that we discontinued their prescriptions either due to some abnormal results or non-adherence, such as not coming in for required monitoring or appointments, they may have subsequently transferred. But the initial reason that their prescription was stopped was because of that. And about 12% of our patients have moved to a pain clinic. That has certainly been challenging in this area in Maine, as many pain clinics are no longer prescribing opioids for patients. So there has been a little bit of back and forth with some patients that move to pain clinics have then tried to come back, but they understand we will continue to taper them. And if you have had a specialist such as an oncologist or orthopedist or somebody who's doing their prescribing. A small number have transitioned directly into the MAT or Suboxone program here at the health center and to outside programs. Even though that number was perhaps a little bit smaller than we thought it might have been initially, again, the perspectives of Gail, in particular from treating those patients, has been invaluable as we tried to understand the process that patients were going through. And this, I think, is maybe the most interesting slide. So going back to January 1st of 2019, these are all of our patients that were prescribed greater than or equal to 15 morphine milligram equivalents. And I subsequently then broke that down into greater than or equal to 90. Then I chose some arbitrary, what seemed to me very high numbers of morphine milligram equivalents, 200, 500, and 1,000. The patients that were on 1,000 or more morphine milligram equivalents were mostly on methadone for chronic pain. So we had 3 patients that were over 1,000 morphine milligram equivalents. And you can see that as of a year ago, July 1st of 2020, we had no patients on that. And again, this number still includes the palliative care patients. So I happen to know, because I've spent a lot of time with this data, that this one person that was over 500 and is now under 500 is palliative care. I also know that the person who was prescribed the highest morphine milligram equivalent when we started was a patient that I inherited and was on methadone, a gentleman in his 70s for a cause of pain that has not yet been identified. I did use the Schmidt Institute recommendations because a methadone taper is very complicated, though I also spaced that out a little bit slower than what was recommended as the quickest possible taper. That patient is now using a Butrans patch, which is buprenorphine patch, which is a much safer alternative for somebody. While cannot be counted as completely off of medication, the risk of a gentleman in his 70s being on over 1,000 morphine milligram equivalents a day, now being down to a long-acting buprenorphine patch, is significantly decreased, that risk. This purple line shows the daily morphine milligram equivalents. I had already referenced that at the starting point, this was up at 89. And again, the palliative care exemption is 90 in Maine. We are now down to 28. So while we do still have 67 patients remaining on chronic opioids at this point, only 9 of them are at 50 or above for morphine milligram equivalents, and the average is 28. So just to summarize a little bit of that data and the important points, that we've had really steady progress, but it has been slow and steady over the past 2 years towards safer opioid prescribing. In total, we've actually had 223 patients because that 211 didn't capture all of patients that maybe had gone to a pain clinic and came back. So 223 individual patients that have been prescribed chronic opioids since January 1st of 2019, and now with 67 remaining as of July 1st, 2021. The dose reduction we know improves safety. So the average prescribed daily morphine milligram equivalent per patient was up at 89 and is now down to 28. Tapering does not lead to significant attrition of patients from the practice. 156 patients that had been on chronic opioids are no longer on chronic opioids as of July 1st of this year. And the majority of those were actually tapered off and only 14% transferred from the practice. Shakopee Valley Health Center is seeking to be part of the solution to this opioid epidemic by decreasing the amount of opioids prescribed daily from over 18,000 morphine milligram equivalents to under 2,000. And anecdotally, patients have told me that they have noticed it is much harder to find prescription pills on the street around here since this process has started. So lessons that we learned through this. Compassionate tapering is very hard work. It is hard for those doing the prescriptions. It is hard for the staff at the health center who get those calls. It is hard for the board of directors who hear complaints. And it is especially hard for the patients. There are many resources available. We can go buy the book. You can read many articles. You can follow a structured tapering guideline. You can go 10% a week. You can do a rapid taper of 25% a week. You can find all of those resources out there, but it's very different, especially as Dr. Royer said, when you are face to face with that patient in the room. They are a real person at that point, not just a grid for how to decrease the medication. So we found the best approach for us at the health center incorporated both the science of tapering, the reasons behind tapering, as Dr. Nesson had mentioned in his piece, and that there aren't indications for the long-term opioid use for most of the diagnoses for which they were prescribed, but also this biopsychosocial model, really taking into account the whole patient, their whole experience, and how to best meet their needs during a very difficult time. Teamwork, teamwork, teamwork. Partnering Dr. Royer and also some of our nurse practitioners and physician assistants with a nurse that was very comfortable with these conversations really took off a lot of the burden from the person having to do the prescribing and allowed that nurse to become part of the team and a trusted resource for patients. They would ask for her when they called. She even came into appointments so she could meet them face to face, and having that third person to deflect a little bit, again, some of that emotion, anger, and blame was helpful as long as that person was strong enough to take that. And we were very lucky in that sense. Peer discussion during dedicated time for opioid stewardship increases clinician comfort with tapering and consistency in prescribing. So we continue to meet at least twice a month now as we've gotten through a lot of that tapering. The new clinicians that have been hired at the health center have not had the same experience of those ones who unfortunately quit early on when they realized what they walked into, because now we have a support system and a process and they don't feel alone. Also, the consistency, we talk about the patients, so we make sure people are doing generally the same things. Of course, there's always individual clinician judgment, but we don't have the outliers that had previously been here as far as those very high doses. Then utilizing the knowledge and skills from those who have worked extensively with patients with opioid use disorder. I think Gail is always very eloquent in the way she described her evolving role on the team was on point. It was so important to have her perspective, and it became more important as this process went on. The initial cutting people down from some higher doses to lower doses was actually easier sometimes than the last few steps of the taper. And that was something that Gail really taught us and showed us how to appreciate. And then data tells a story. I have used those graphs to report to our board of directors and to that HRSA grant I was part of. And while it's time consuming to go into each one of those individual charts and patients' prescription monitoring programs to see what they're prescribed at those intervals, it's very important for us to know what is happening to these patients. Where are we as far as our prescribing at this point? Thank you for listening to our presentation today. We're going to look into the chat and see if there are any questions that were shared there. So I see a comment from Dr. Fally Mock, who did come out and speak with us and offer, and she is a great resource if other people are finding themselves in a similar position and need to reach out to her. And she does explain in there, they're a state-funded program. They do have different CME modules that can be done about opioid reduction and MAT strategies. So, and again, there's no commercial influence in those, which is very valuable. Oh, and Noah was able to join us in the chat. Thank you, Dr. Nesson. Great. If I don't see any other comments in the chat, we'd certainly be happy to pass along our contact information if anybody thought that it would be helpful if they're also in a similar position of opioid deprescribing. Oh, I guess I do see it. What sorts of explanations made it easier for patients? That is an excellent question. So you want to take that one, Dr. Royer?
Yeah, that's one of the things that I always had to do is actually believe that it was the important thing to do, because if you don't believe it, you're just not going to do the job. And getting across the safety factor is what I always tried to do. I think that would answer that question. It's, the explanation is that it's done not to hurt people, but because of safety. And that's a thing that most people have not believed.
Yeah.
I even didn't believe it before, but I do. And I had to believe it to work with it. And that was the primary concern, was the safety factor.
I think I would add one thing to that, which is that I really tried to talk with patients about the fact that the long-term opioid prescriptions were making them feel worse, that it was affecting their mental health, that it was affecting their physical health, and that hyperalgesia is a real thing. And really, the benefits were going to be down the road, but needed to really understand the physiology.
And I will add that, again, through all of the trainings and CMEs that I've done, I'm taught to tell patients that we're doing this for their benefit. That doesn't always go over very well with the patients that, again, have been accustomed to being on these medications, sometimes for 20 plus years. So, so sometimes, as Dr. Royer said, we had to throw up our hands and say, well, the committee said we had to do it. And that may sound like a cop-out, and I'm going to be honest, but again, when you're face-to-face in a room, sometimes in a tough situation, and say, this is what it is, and this is the process that we're following here. Many patients believe they are special and they are exceptional, and their case should not be lumped in with the guidelines that we're following. And there's a piece, as Gail mentioned as well too, of differences between prescription use and other kinds of substance use. And patients, in my experience, would frequently say, you're doing this because of those people having a problem, and not being able to recognize at all that, no, we were tapering their chronic medications because they weren't indicated. I'm getting, I think, a 1 minute warning here. There was a question.
A 10-second comment to that, which is something the nurse that worked with us always mentioned, which was they were not alone in this process, to stay connected with us. And she really worked hard at that as well. It made a difference.
There was a quick question I think I can address quickly about methadone. How is the weaning off different? That was something that I learned from the Schmidt tapers that were given to us. So if you look up any resource on converting methadone to morphine milligram equivalents, you'll see that at different doses, methadone acts differently. So at higher doses, it's stronger. And at lower doses, you do a lower conversion factor. So I think at 20 and under, you convert by 4. So, 1 milligram of methadone is like 4 of morphine. So what I learned through the tapers that we were given is that at those different stages where the methadone conversion factor changes because of that metabolism changing, it's important to pause that taper.
Add a comment. I had a combination of methadone and oxycodones a lot. And a lot of times the people wanted to go off the methadone.
All right. I think we're at the end of our time, but thank you so much for joining us today.
I woke up this morning, this is the longest I've ever stayed clean. This past April, I celebrated 19 years in recovery, and that's great. My story isn't very unique. I found it's quite generic. I've heard it several times over the years. I started using it at a young age. My parents split up, and I held quite the resentment because of that. And, I used what I thought was using to be social, to be accepted, and going into early teens, I used more and more to get in, fit in with people. My using progressed throughout the years, through several different high schools, and when I reached my 20s, I really started going downhill with intravenous drug use. I became a heroin addict and started burning bridges left and right. My family no longer trusted me. I was about to be kicked out of the relationship I was in. My family was not willing to put me up, so I was heading for homelessness as I saw it. So I walked down to Main Street in Hyannis, Massachusetts, and there was a woman's office and it said drug and alcohol counselor on it. And I walked in and I sat down with her and I asked if I could talk, and she said, yeah. And for the first time I could remember, I was honest. I had told her everything that I was doing, all the way back to my teen years, everything that I had been up to, what I was using, how I was using. It was the first time that I could remember being honest, and it was like relieving. It was so relieving, and I'm not sure what I was expecting, but she said she could help me, and she would point me in the right direction, and she was going to have me call this gentleman to get into a program, and I said, great, I'll take his number. And like any person in an active addiction, had she given me the number, I probably would have left, and feeling so good about being honest, I would have gone out and used within minutes. But she knew better, so she handed me the phone right there and made me make the call. And I started the journey right then. That was 2002, April 21st. So I remember I was in a meeting in Falmouth, Massachusetts one night, and I don't remember the gentleman's name, I don't remember what he looks like, what he talked about, but I do remember he said that the pain was inevitable, but the suffering was optional. And something clicked. I mean, I didn't, leave that meeting and buy Birkenstocks and beads and hug everybody down the street, but I left that meeting a little bit lighter. I left that meeting understanding that for the first time in my life, I made a choice. I made a choice first to get honest, and then I made a choice to change my life. And then if I was making this choice, that I would need to participate a little more. I started realizing there was all kinds of people doing it a different way. I felt so dedicated to this 112-step program that I had lost the idea of that there was other paths around me. And then I started meeting different people, and we started a men's meditation group. And I met men from all walks of recovery. And I started feeling myself growing. And I don't know, it was the best choice I ever made. It was the best choice I ever made. And from there, my life is, I don't want to say second to none, but I got great things. I have 2 kids, twin girls that have never seen me use. I have twin girls that, when they woke up in the middle of the night in nightmares, they knew exactly where to go to find me. I would be there. I would hold their hair back while they threw up in toilets. When they hit their teen years, I would talk about things like women's things and be able to be there. I have a son that is in his young 30s that he did not always have that. Unfortunately, I exposed him to a lot of different things he probably shouldn't have. But the good thing is that he's seen me grow. And I met Ryan when he was 3, and his father was not in the picture. So he was all I had, and I was all he had. And by every means, have gone through what he's gone through with me, and watching all the stuff and the theft and the lies and all the deceit and dishonesty, he'd want nothing to do with me. I'd want nothing to do with me if I was him. But when he introduces me to somebody now, he says, "This is Chris, this is my father." And that's huge. That's like one of those gifts of recovery you can never really kind of explain to people. That and, like, house keys to my mother's house. I have those again. I don't even live in the same state, but I have those. I don't know. I love being clean. I love being able to be available for family. I love the fact that my family trusts me again, that they can count on me. I'm an active member of my community. I like the fact that people in my community know who I am, and not by an infamous way. That they get happy when they see me. I'm friendly with my neighbors. I enjoy showing up today.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hope everyone had some time for lunch and is enjoying this great day. I'm Dr. Larry McCullough, Executive Director of Pine Tree Institute. I'm joined today by Mark Lefebvre, who's our Director of Community Outreach. We want to share with you some of the work that we've been doing around adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. We've heard a lot of references today about those. Positive experiences, principles of trauma-informed care, and how that can impact a community response to substance use disorder. We want to express our thanks to Governor Mills and to Director Smith for organizing these great summits 3 years in a row now. It's so powerful in terms of spreading information. We're really happy to be part of this. I will share my screen. And share a few thoughts with you on how we can think about the impact of adverse childhood experiences and the way they impact our communities. And I just want to check, is the screen being shared? Yes, it is. Okay. I'd like to start by thanking our community sponsors. We have had some amazing support from community sponsors in the direct areas that we have been working with: Southern Maine, primarily York County, and the 2 counties of Seacoast, New Hampshire, Stratford County and Rockingham County. We have, over the past year and a half, a powerful initiative in ACEs awareness training, what we call our Master Trainer program. And this was actually a Kennebunk Savings Bank Spotlight Fund project. You heard Brad Page mention this morning their Spotlight Fund. This was one of their focus initiatives. We've been very grateful to the incredible work that Brad Page and Liz Torrance, their Director of Social Responsibility, and everyone at Kennebunk Savings Bank has done to support these initiatives. And also support from Rotary clubs in Rotary District 7780. We've had support from over 15 separate Rotary clubs in the area we're working with, as well as the Maine Community Foundation and the Foundation for Seacoast Health. We want to share with you some of the work from the ACEs Awareness Initiative, but particularly how that has been built into the work of the Portsmouth, New Hampshire Coordinated Response to Substance Use Disorder, and increasingly now as we're beginning work with the Greater Kennebunk Coordinated Response. I'm going to share a little bit about the ACEs background and the principles of trauma-informed care. Then I'll be turning it over to Mark to talk about the coordinated response and some of the impact that that's been having. My guess is that many of you in this session are familiar with the concept of ACEs, so I'll touch on it pretty quickly. There's a lot of research, and if you're looking for more background information, we have some online courses on the Pine Tree Institute website, and there's also a lot of other resources and materials. But many of you probably know that about 20 years ago, two researchers, Rob Anda and Dr. Vince Folletti, conducted a large study, epidemiological study, of patients at Kaiser Permanente in San Diego. And they specifically asked questions about how adverse childhood experiences impacted adult health issues. They looked at 3 types of abuse: physical, emotional, and sexual. They looked at 2 types of neglect: physical and emotional, and 5 types of what you could call household dysfunctional: mental illness, substance use in the family, domestic violence, divorce, and a parent incarcerated. Their findings have been documented and over the 20 years since have been replicated in many different studies. But the original findings were pretty stunning. One of the first findings was that ACEs were very common. And if you listen to Dr. Anda and Dr. Folletti talk about this, they were shocked. There's a wonderful video of Rob Anda when he first looked at this data. He said he cried. He had no idea that there was this much adversity in our communities. So if you look at just some of these numbers, we know a lot about, we've heard substance use. 25% of the individuals reported there had been substance abuse in their home. You'll see other figures: physical abuse, over 25%, sexual abuse, over 20%. And we know from other studies that 1 in 5 women and 1 in 6 men have been sexually abused. So a tremendous amount of abuse in these various areas that individuals reported, much higher than was expected, and much higher than is acknowledged in most of our communities. And an important part of this study, too, is this was not a difficult population. This was mostly white. It was mostly college educated and middle class. So this was not due to some other environmental factors. This was the families that many of us know. What was then particularly interesting is then they started to look at the incidence of the numbers of these and developed what many of you are probably familiar with, what they called an ACE score. And this is really, it's very simply just the number of adverse experiences that an individual reported. And what they found was that as the number of ACEs went up, the amount and severity of other kinds of health issues also went up. And we'll look more specifically at some of that. So this is what they found in the Kaiser study, that about 10% of the population, which is pretty huge, experienced 4 or more ACEs, which were a strong predictor of fairly serious adult health risk issues. So that was a mostly white, mostly middle class population. Since then, there have been other studies with what we might call high risk populations. So this is one study from Florida. This is juvenile offenders, and they looked at the count of ACE scores. So on this chart, the blue lines here are the number from the Kaiser study. So you see about 10% had 4 or more ACEs. You'll see that in this high-risk population of juvenile offenders, it was a very different picture, much more extreme. So almost none of them reported 0 ACEs. That number goes up, and at the 4 or more level, about 50% of that population reported that they had experienced 4 or more of those adverse experiences, putting them at risk for many other adult issues. This is the chart that always makes me sad, because what this says is that the kids who are the most abused in our society, our response to them is we put them in jail. Now, they have acted out, probably, but instead of finding ways to help them with the acting out, they're now incarcerated. Very powerful statistic that's been replicated many times over. So why is this ACE score relevant to what we're talking about today? 2 of the issues that are most tightly correlated to high ACE scores are addictions and suicide. And thank you to the wonderful presentation this morning on suicide, making the relationship between substance use and suicide so clear. The chart on the left is the correlation between ACE scores and using intravenous drugs, you'll see as the number of adverse experiences goes up, the number of people who use intravenous drugs goes up by a factor of about 10. The chart on the left relates to suicide attempts. As the number of ACE scores goes up 7 or more, it's a factor of 20 times more people attempt suicide with ACE scores of 7 or more. And at the bottom of the screen, you can see ACE scores of 6 or more, about a 20-year shortening of lifespan. Neurologists have started, since this study was done, at first there was a lot of disbelief. We had a chance to work with Dr. Anda directly last fall, and he explained that when they first did this research, a lot of the medical journals wouldn't publish their research because they said it couldn't be true. They replicated, it's now been replicated in many other areas, and researchers have started to really look at why this might be. And this pyramid, typically when we are looking at health issues, we'll look toward the top of this pyramid when things start to become evident. We look at disease and disability that we can actually observe, or social problems. Sometimes we'll track that back to risky behaviors, and we'll look at health risks. Sometimes track that back to social emotional learning and cognitive functioning. What the ACEs research has demonstrated conclusively is that the root cause of many of these is those adverse childhood experiences. And it's not just the experiences of this generation, but there's an actual intergenerational transmission. And any of you who saw the wonderful and very, very powerful film, Jacinta, we see the intergenerational links right there. So researchers have made it real, have now documented that there are clear what they call epigenetic, in addition to genetic factors that contribute to the impact of ACEs on long-term life health experiences. One of the ways that this occurs is that there's actual neurological impact. So early childhood experiences, toxic stress experiences, adverse experiences actually have an impact on brain architecture. And now we have methods of looking at this, and they found that at certain critical periods when there are adverse experiences, there's actual neurological damage and neurons are actually attenuated. So you see in this picture, healthy neurons are rich and connected. Under conditions of toxic stress, those neurons are pruned and the connections are severed so that there is actual less connection, there's brain impact. What this says to me is there is injury, but because we can't see it, we often neglect that. If someone came in, if a kid came into a classroom and they'd been hit by a car and they had 2 broken legs and they were in a wheelchair, we would immediately know that that child probably needed some extra attention and some extra help. Kids who've been exposed to adverse experiences that have neurological impact, we can't necessarily see that. So it's very easy to overlook it and respond as though there is something wrong with them. So why this is important is that all of these contribute to a huge number of what we think of as public health risks. And this chart's kind of a crazy chart. Laura Porter, who did a lot of the work in Washington State, called this her oil slick chart. And what this shows is the percentage of risk that is due to differential ACEs, so population attributable risk. And if you look down here, so IV drug use, 78%. What that means is that 78% of the difference in IV drug use can be attributed to differences in ACE scores. In other words, people with high ACE scores are much more likely to engage in IV drug use. And the source of that risk is not necessarily social factors, it's 78% of it is attributed to differences in ACE scores. And you look at some of these other: alcoholism, 67%, suicide attempts, 65%, mental illness, another very common associated factor, 69%, depression, 40%. You can look sort of around the circle and see all of the things that are impact: smoking, injury or illness, being out of work, interrupted activities, so on. What this says is, if you think of it as an oil slick, if we were to turn it so that this disc were flat, and we push really hard on the oil in one of these areas, let's say we push really hard on IV drug use, what happens to the oil? Well, it goes somewhere else. The idea of addressing ACEs is, let's drill a hole in the middle and drain the oil. If we can drain the adversity, so to speak, or reduce the level of adversity, not only do we impact IV drug use, we impact all of these factors around the circle. So that's the big concept around understanding ACEs and addressing ACEs. So I want to, real quickly, at this point, I always like to pause a little bit. And if we were in person, we would have a little conversation about how people are responding. My guess is many of you have seen much of this information before, but if this is the first time that you're seeing this information, and if you're anything like I was the first time I saw it, you might be sort of counting up in your head. Okay, well, boom, 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 boom. You know, I personally have a very high ACE score, and I was counting up in my head and getting a little worried. The really important thing to understand is that the ACE scores are predictable at a population level, but they are not predictable at a personal level. So I've known individuals with very high ACE scores who have had none of these risk factors. I've known people with very low ACE scores who've had many of them. So it's really important to remember that the ACE score is an indication of population risk, but doesn't necessarily say what our own personal risk is going to be. So if you're feeling anxious about that's an important thing to remember. So the question at this point is, okay, these are really powerful. They're important to address. What do we do about it? And this is where some of the more recent research on positive experiences and the impact of buffering relationships has become so important. And what we are learning is that the capacity to create healing relationships has a powerful impact on our capacity to buffer the impact of adverse childhood experiences. Some of the most exciting research, and some of you I know are familiar with this, Dr. Bethel was a keynote speaker at the conference we sponsored last October, as was Director Smith. The research that Christina Bethel led, very similar to the ACEs research, asked the opposite question. The epidemiological study, a large number of individuals, over 7,000 in the state of Wisconsin, and they looked for, is there a correlation between any positive experiences and do those have an impact on the adverse experiences that individuals might experience? And they found that, in fact, there was and is a very powerful impact. So one of the things that they looked at 7 factors: able to talk to their family about feelings, felt that their family stood up for them in difficult times, felt safe and protected by an adult in their home, at least 2 non-parent adults took genuine interest. That's huge, by the way. Felt supported by their friends, felt a sense of belonging at high school. That's the one they asked specifically. Since then, it's been broadened to sense of belonging at school in general, and enjoyed participating in community traditions. These were the ones they looked at. It's interesting, as I'm reading down this list, I'm thinking what an impact COVID has had on some of these, like participating in community traditions and a sense of belonging at school and supported by friends when we've been isolated. So some real challenges that we could see. But what they found in the research was very powerful. So two things. This chart, upper left with the green and the orange. So in this chart, green is good. And what they found in each of these areas, each of these 7 areas that they looked at, is that when individuals reported higher incidences of those experiences in their lives, they were less likely, so never, rarely, or sometimes, they were less likely to report that they experienced depression and poor mental health as adults. And you can see that there's quite an impact, particularly for some of them, like felt supported in your home, and even the sense of belonging in high school. So individually, each one of those factors had apparently is related to a capacity to buffer the impact of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. It's important to remember that all of these are correlational studies, so we don't know that one causes the other, but we do know that when these positive experiences exist, people are less likely to experience some of the impact. And then what's really fascinating about it, they did the same kind of cumulative effect, said, is there a cumulative effect? And in fact, they found the same kind of dose relationship or stepwise increase, that individuals who experienced 6 to 7 PCEs, or positive experiences, were even more likely to report that they did not have depression or mental illness. And they looked at several factors. This is just one of the results that we pulled out as an example. In other research and other communities, some of you may be familiar with the work of Laura Porter in Washington State. They looked at the impact of relationships and introducing trauma-informed approaches in communities, and looked at over time what the impact of those factors would be. So a couple of things, you're probably not able to read all of the details on these graphs on the left, but they had a sort of natural experiment in Washington State that some communities adopted trauma-informed approaches and some communities decided not to, and they were able to track differential rates in some of these communities. And the green lines on these charts are the communities that adopted the trauma-informed approaches. This happens to be a teenage wellness example, but they looked at high school dropout rates, significantly reduced in those communities that adopted trauma-informed approaches, freshman to senior dropout, drug juvenile arrests, alcohol juvenile arrests. The red dotted lines are the communities that did not adopt these approaches. And you'll see that in some there was actually an increase as opposed to a decrease. Laura Porter, in her work analyzing this, in a way, prefigured some of Christina Bethel's work, because they looked at community support and looked at 4 specific kinds of community support that they found made a difference. So one is emotional support. Do you feel that you have a source of social emotional support and hope? And they looked at differential impact on adult experience of mental health and ability to gain emotional support, and found that there was a direct impact. Multiple sources of help. Do I have 2 or more people, very similar to the Christina Bethel research, that I can call if I need help? It's not just one person. Reciprocity is someone doing for me and I will do for them. I'll weed your garden if you watch my kids. I'll go to the grocery store if you can take care of my elderly parent. Anything that allows for shared support and help in difficult times. And then a 4th one, which is really interesting, which is becoming more and more clear. And there was a lot of conversation this morning about coalition building. You're going to hear about some in a minute from some of the work we've been doing. But this idea of social bridging, a capacity to reach outside your normal social circle to get help for family or friends. So I'm comfortable calling the law enforcement community because they've got great programs. Heard some wonderful things about the HOPE program in Scarborough, for example. I'm able to reach out and call. I'm able to make connections. Some of you may know about ACERTS programs, ACE response teams, where they actually create a link between law enforcement and families. So many ways that we can create that bridge that then helps to alleviate some of the impact of these adverse experiences. Another really important point, and this is the intergenerational point, is in Washington State, they found that you could predict the ACE scores of children by the ACE scores of their parents. That makes sense. The second part was when they provided support and help for the parents, parental buffering, the health outcomes for their children improved. And they were able to document this over a 10-year period. And in fact, Laura Porter's group documented a savings of about $10 million over a 10-year period in services that were not required. So this has a huge impact in the way we think about serving our communities. The final point that I really want to share to sort of pull this all together, and then we want to give you an actual example of how this might work in a community, is we're not talking about a new program or a new initiative or a new slogan that we adopt. What really has to happen, and we've been hearing it all morning in terms of stigma reduction and community attitude, is we really are looking for a change in mindset, which is a shift in the culture. So one that many of you may have heard of people say is we want to shift from what is wrong with you? Why are you acting so crazy? Why are you doing such bad things? To what happened to you? What is it in your experience that has led to this? You know, we often hear of substance use disorder as self-medication. So the question I always ask when I'm talking to people, maybe not in these terms, but in essence, what is it that happened that drove this need to self-medicate so intensely? And there's a lot of research now looking at addiction. There was an article in the New York Times earlier this week that looked at the impact of early experiences as being the primary differentiator and not necessarily the specific drugs. So from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. And then the second piece, a little more subtle, our typical response often in society is reject and eject. So that's a bad kid, throw him out of class, send him to the principal's office. That's a bad kid, throw him out of school. That's a bad kid, put him in jail. So we get that school to prison pipeline by rejecting the individual and ejecting, mostly because we don't know what else to do. So the question then becomes, how do we engage with compassion? So really having compassion, what happened to you, and finding the right fit. There was very poignant talk this morning in the Voices of Recovery, and also the conversation with Governor Mills that started us off of the belief that everybody has a place and everyone has a role. So engaging with compassion and helping to find that role is a large part of what our work is. And it's that change in mindset that drives that. So it takes us then reviewing recovery as really this double continuum of driving down the adverse experiences. We clearly need to do that. And also then buffering and bolstering the positive experiences that build robust positive health. And this double continuum then is the driver of what we do. So if we take this philosophy, you know, these are great things to talk about. The question that we have been asking and working with communities is, how can we drive these into the core of the work we do with communities? And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Mark Lefebvre, who's been doing some incredible work with what we call our coordinated response efforts. and he's going to share a little bit of the work we've done in Portsmouth and that we're in the process of doing with Kennebunk. So with that, Mark, I'm going to turn it to you.
Thanks, Larry. Again, everybody, good afternoon. It's a privilege to be here this afternoon. My name is Mark Lefebvre, and I am the Director of Community Engagement at Pine Tree Institute. I'm also a person in long-term recovery and very much a poster child of, I guess, the mantra or the subtext, the end of the story has not yet been written. So anyway, I just wanted, before we jump into this material, I wanted to circle back to a couple of things I heard this morning that are entirely in line with what I'm going to talk about and what Larry and I are talking about, and to maybe bring it back to the surface. And first and foremost, Dr. Shah mentioned that substance use disorder is a public health issue. Right on. We're going to get into how that is very much the case here in the work that we're doing. And then secondarily, I just heard Mr. Botticelli, and I'm paraphrasing here, but it will take what is happening at the community level to make a difference with this opioid epidemic. And that's also the case in what we're trying to do here with, excuse me, with the Portsmouth Coordinated Response to Substance Use Disorder. So anyway, let's jump in. So couple of things to maybe bring to the forefront here and reframe. Pine Tree Institute, first of all, we partnered with a group of community champions from the seacoast of New Hampshire city of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Many of you have passed through Portsmouth on your way, blinking on your way from Maine to Massachusetts. And this is some of the work that has transpired and some of the results that we've seen as a result of this. So we got together and built a coalition to address the impact of substance use disorder in the seacoast. But before we do jump in, I'd like to reinforce this issue of substance use disorder and reframe it from one of being a moral failing and one requiring punishment to one of public health that affects every facet of the community. And then following that, we'd like to introduce this concept of a community coordinated response, which we found to be a very successful model for addressing substance use disorders in the community. So let's see if I can figure out a way to advance this chart. There we go. So framing the opioid epidemic as a public health issue. Many of us have seen the national dialogue around opioids that has been dominated by several approaches that, at least over my lifetime, are at best inadequate or worst, harmful. The so-called war on drugs, for instance, it's an approach that attempts to arrest our way out of drug use and distribution. And this approach has had long-term scarring effects on many communities, most of them urban, and most of them affecting those primarily of color, and without having any measurable impact on the supply of street drugs. And since 1971, I guess, since Richard Nixon embarked on this war on drugs, President Richard Nixon, the United States has been estimated to have spent over $1 trillion on the war on drugs in form of interdiction and so forth. Likewise, defining drug use as an individual's moral failing that can be remedied through willpower alone is inconsistent with the biological triggers that create susceptibility to addiction in the first place. And a lot of that Larry just talked about, and he shared with this whole moral failing approach, failing to recognize the role of trauma and adverse childhood experiences in addiction. And furthermore, the single-minded focus on abstinence has led to a lot of opposition from evidence against evidence-based treatments such as methadone, bupe, and other forms of harm reduction. And then finally, moving beyond a moralized and punitive approach to addiction could really help reduce the stigma and associated acceptance of treatment, and not only for the benefit of the individuals who are using opioids, but also for society and the community at large. So let's introduce this concept of the community coordinated response to substance use. And I'm just going to read right from the top here. It's a collaborative effort of the full range of community agencies and organizations to address the substance use challenge based on trauma-informed principles. And what you'll see here is kind of a gearbox, and we use that as a metaphor here. But what this entails is involving the community to develop policies, to develop practices, to develop new approaches that are recovery responsive. And more specifically, it involves changing the discriminatory public policies in the areas of healthcare, employment, education, corrections, housing, and other functional areas of the community to eliminate barriers to access. It means developing the networks, the systems that work together cohesively like a well-oiled machine, not unlike this gearbox. And it shifts the focus on addiction as a public health crisis that attempts to restore dignity with people with addiction. And what we see as potential outcomes, rather, that we're looking for are reduction in overdose deaths, reduction in Narcan administration, reduction in EMT cases or ER visits, emergency room visits, reduction in crime and recidivism, decreases in homelessness, reduction in substance misuse related illnesses, hepatitis, HIV, lower unemployment rates and lower school dropout rates and lower teen pregnancies. So these are some of the outcomes at a macro level that we can expect to see if a community can put together its resources and work in a coordinated fashion to address substance use disorder. And we're here to tell you today that not only is this model on paper work, but we've seen it work in some of the work that we're doing in Portsmouth and that we're embarking on in other parts of New England, including southern Maine. So the genesis of the Portsmouth Coordinated Response to Substance Use Disorder was in the spring of 2019 when a group of like-minded community leaders, sector leaders, converged to discuss the alarming trends within Portsmouth that were directly related to substance use disorders. And these trends included increased overdoses, things that I talked about earlier in terms of outcomes that we'd like to see, increased Narcan administrations, ER visits, arrests, truancy, and other negative community outcomes. So Pine Tree Institute was brought in to facilitate several collaborative sessions where the concerns and the ideas from all of these folks were shared. And most importantly, as we went through this exercise, we sensed the willingness of these sector leaders and these community activists to think differently about the impact of substance use disorder within the Portsmouth community. And what you see here is actually a picture from one of our first meetings with representation from this steering committee that we put together. Just doing a time check here. In June of 2019, the city of Portsmouth appropriated a grant and matched a grant that was put together by the Rotary Club of Portsmouth. Larry had mentioned some of our sponsors at the front. I'll highlight them again when I finish here. And as a result of that, we put together a cross-sector community, a steering committee rather, and that steering committee was established to identify the top priority areas and barriers that are addressed that are related to substance use disorder in the Portsmouth community. Those barriers include things that would prevent people from gaining access to the services where the services did exist, but also identify where we had gaps in services so that we can put things together that would address those needs. So we took a two-phase approach. Phase one focused on assessing the community priorities and creating plans for actions to address these priorities. And phase two involved the coordination of 5 task forces that emerged from these 5 priorities to identify these existing services and service gaps, followed by recommendations for the steering committee going forward. I didn't name names here in the picture that you see here with regards to the steering committee. However, I do want to highlight the fact that we had very high level participation, not only at the steering committee level, but also many of these very steering committee members participated in one, if not more, of the task forces that came out of the steering committee. So you can see here, we've had first responders, we had educators, we had administrators, town, city government, state senators. We had folks that were responsible for working with the homeless, peer recovery organizations, the Economic Commission, mental health services, and so on and so forth. And so you can see here, we had a very strong representation, and we would not have had the success that we had, by the way, if not for this representation that we see here. So in December of 2019, a little over a year and a half ago, we kicked off the Coordinated Response Committee by forming the 5 task forces with a chairperson or 2 for each of these task forces. And going clockwise, I'm sorry, not clockwise, starting in the top left here, we had access and connectivity. And I'm going to go through each one of these in detail. Access and connectivity, we had a task force that addressed the lack of sober living homes in Rockingham County. We had a task force that addressed community education and training, one that addressed employment and helping folks that are in recovery go back to work, as well as to work with the employers within the Seacoast area on the recovery-friendly workforce initiative that we heard earlier from Shannon and John Burns from SOS. And last but certainly not least, services coordination. And we'll talk a little bit about what the objectives were for each of these, what some of our findings were, what our recommendations are going forward, and talk about where we go from here. So let's start with access and connectivity. Initially, transportation was identified as a major gap in the Seacoast, with very few existing public options other than long-established bus routes that didn't always take people to the last mile. However, once we get into the thick of COVID, it quickly became obvious to us that connectivity and access to tele-recovery services and telehealth services superseded the need for physical transportation. So we quickly shifted our focus to technology for accessibility and connectivity to these services. And what we determined is that, sorry, let me go back. What we determined is that many people who were seeking recovery services lacked the connectivity, the smartphones, the data plans that allowed them to gain access to their doctors, their service providers, both clinical and non-clinical services. And so we leveraged the existing phone distribution program that was already in place within Stratford County and championed by the Stratford County Public Health Network. And so the objectives of this program were to evaluate existing options that enabled individuals to have access to telehealth, telerecovery, and other services. As I said earlier, it evolved from the original transportation focused. What we did was we conducted outreach and we continue to conduct outreach and recruit partners for distribution and support for these phones that we're handing out, and then to issue a report with our findings and recommendation. So the results of this particular work task force was the formation of the Seacoast Health Connect program in partnership with T-Mobile, who donated the phones. We received grant money to pay for the data plans. We handed out the phones. We paid for the data plans. We administered, we hand these phones out, and we have enough funds in place to continue this program for up to 18 months to those in recovery, all free of charge to those individuals. And so the end result here has been a closing of the gap for individuals needing access to these services. Our recommendation to the steering committee going forward is to monitor usage to continue to improve program effectiveness. And we're going to revisit this in the future. We're in the process of looking at acquiring a second batch of 100 phones because the demand for this program has been so high. The second task force is the housing task force. At the time of the formation of this task force, there were exactly 0 recovery homes in all of Rockingham County, which is the perhaps the most affluent of all the counties within the state of New Hampshire. And so sober living and transitional living were huge gaps as we serve the Seacoast area. In the second 3 quarters, the second 9 months, the last 9 months of 2020, there were 80 cases of individuals needing a sober living residence that were referred, that had to be referred out of Rockingham County because of the lack of services. And so what we did was we evaluated the state of recovery housing in the Seacoast. We determined that there were financial resources in the form of grants and loans, 0 interest loans. We evaluated best practices from other parts of the state. We have a relationship with the New Hampshire Coalition of Recovery Residences, which is the certification administration for recovery homes. And then the last objective was to issue the report and findings that we presented to the steering committee. The results were that even though there were no recovery homes in the Seacoast, there are operators that are available that are interested in pursuing this as a potential solution. Property values and lack of inventory are a major barrier. And we also learned that a nonprofit model would be the most prudent financially, as well as in terms of motives for potential operators. And we're connecting these potential operators with grant programs and zero interest loan administrators through a planning committee that we've established as our recommendation going forward for this task force. The third of the task force is community education, and this involves reducing the stigma of childhood trauma. What we determined that there was a need for education for those organizations that provide direct services to our youth. These include recreational organizations, after-school programs, youth sports, etc. And so we're doing things like adverse childhood training. We've got master trainers that are deployed in the Seacoast to create awareness of the correlation between ACEs as well as some of the negative outcomes. We are seeking funding for a second round of training for what we call community ambassadors. And the results here are we've got a substantial database of organizations and programs that do offer these direct services. Those trainings continue as we speak on ACEs and pieces and trauma-related substance use disorder, and continued deployment of this program across the state. The fourth is employment, and this initially started off with helping individuals who are in recovery get the education and develop workforce development services that they needed. As a result of COVID, things have changed a bit. However, we continue to offer outreach and training and education for these individuals. We offer relationships with the New Hampshire Works for Recovery program so that we can connect employers on retention as well as recruiting. And the recommendation is to continue going forward with this program. The fifth and final task force is services coordination, where we're trying to provide visibility for people to navigate the vast network of providers in a timely fashion. And once they enter the ecosystem of providers, be able to conduct a warm handoff from one provider to the other. And so we deployed the Unite Us platform for coordination and navigation across the Seacoast. And we're conducting outreach and recruitment of partners to be able to access Unite Us as we go forward. So where do we go from here? And this is my last chart. We continue with Portsmouth as we expand into the Seacoast. So from Portsmouth, we're going into Exeter, Hampton, Seabrook, and the southern part of the Seacoast to deploy these 5 task forces on a broader scale. We have a similar program underway with Kennebunk, and we're looking for task force members. A little commercial here for what we're doing here: Kennebunkport, and Arundel, and expanding into other southern Maine communities, southern York County as an example. And we're going to be developing turnkey coordinated response programs that will be available on demand, with Pine Tree providing training and technical assistance. So with that, I want to thank everybody here for their attention. I've got Larry and my email here, as well as another shout out to our sponsors. And I guess we'll close there. I don't know if we have time for any questions. I'll defer to Lorena. We have 1 minute. So Larry, I haven't been able to see the chat room. What do we got?
Well, I've been watching chat. I will say that there's a couple of mentions of a great new book, Oprah Winfrey and Bruce Perry, all about adverse childhood experiences, and a great video, Oprah Winfrey and Brene Brown. There are also some other great books, Nadine Barkeris, who's now the Surgeon General of the state of California. So there are some really great resources. And I also just want to say thank you again to the state of Maine for putting together a summit like this, where the information sharing is so profound. I know that Mark and I have been taking part for the last 3 years and have learned so much and gained so much from this. So we look forward to collaborating with many of you as our work goes forward. So with that, I think we can close. Thank you very much, all.
My recovery journey started in 2015. Prior to that, I was an IV heroin user for 5 years. I had some issues with DHHS and had been offered either a 5-month watch, including long-term rehab, or I could go to jail for 2 years. So I had chose, obviously, to go to rehab. I had never been before, so it was my first time. And I was able to bring my kids with me because it was through a DHHS program. So I went there, I was there for 4 months, really got a strong foundation in my recovery. Lived in Connecticut for about 2 years following, and I did pretty well. And then I moved to Maine, and I did well here for a while until I got in a domestic relationship or domestic violence relationship that had resulted in an altercation that the cops were called, and I ended up losing my girls, which had resulted in a relapse. And my 6-year-old at the time was with me. So that event really propelled me into my recovery. At the time, I came back to Maine from visiting my daughter in Connecticut, and I just needed help. So I had reached out to ACAP and their family coaching. And my family coach was a person in long-term recovery who had a lot of experience with Roads to Recovery Community Center, so she referred me here. I came to Roads to Recovery. I was in a very broken spot. The second that my feet hit this floor, my entire life began to change. I met my husband here. We now have a child. I went through a workforce program through ACAP and then volunteered on a paid basis for about 3 months and then got employed as the peer support specialist here at Roads to Recovery. I'm super thankful that I ended up coming to Caribou. Our recovery community out here is very strong. For the first time in my life, I have found myself in a community that I can be proud of who I am. Prior to my recovery, I was an exotic dancer, and that's not really a job you can go out and tell people about, not really something your parents are proud of, not something you can tell your kids you're going to work to do. So that being in that lifestyle in the city, doing that job, I never imagined that I would be talking to state legislators, talking to governors and senators and advocating for people and press and doing all this work toward opening workforce for people in recovery and making a recovery ready community and like having employers be recovery ready. You're trying to rebuild your life so that you're happier, so that you feel better about you, so that you don't go back to that. And that's really what this community has done. And I can say that 12-step meetings have helped and mutual aid meetings have helped, but really the core of my recovery has definitely been my community. I couldn't do it without them. I come to the community center every day now, and magic happens here. Like, people get housed, people get jobs, people get their kids back, people fall in love and get married. People do so many great things. We have a staff here that is just so dedicated to recovery. I would have never found this in Connecticut. I don't think I would have ever been able to be healthy there. So I'm super thankful that I'm here, that this is available. Glad to be able to be a mother again. Glad to be able to be a wife, and to be able to go to my psychiatrist and her tell me that I have awareness and that I'm able to identify my shortcomings and work toward them and things like that that seem little, but I never would have been able to do that had I not gotten in this lifestyle of recovery. All right, so these are my girls. This is Anastasia Jade. She's my newest little one. She was born in March, so almost 3 months. And this is my little Madison. And I also have 2 others, Callie Jane, who is 7, and Brandon Anthony, who is 9. And that's my little fam.
Everybody. As it's harder to get lost in virtual space, but not impossible, we hope you're here to talk with us today about promoting health equity and prevention through youth engagement best practices. Before Nina and I introduce ourselves, I would love to take a moment just to read a land acknowledgement. So sharing my screen. As we gather in this place, we want to acknowledge that we are occupying the traditional territory and ancestral lands of the Wabanaki people, who for thousands of years have called this place home. We acknowledge their continued connection to this land and give thanks for allowing us to do good work on their homeland, and remember their ancestors who were here before us. This was written for us by Denise Altivator of the Passamaquoddy tribe at Sabayak. Thank you for letting us do that, and we'll dive into introductions and then do some framing. So as we move through the day today, I'm Gabe O'Brien. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I work with the Maine Youth Action Network as part of the training and technical assistance team. I'm going to toss it off to Nina in just a moment to introduce herself as well, but we would love to see folks pop into the chat and introduce yourselves. So we invite you to invite your name, your pronouns, where you're calling in from today. And we have a question of the day almost every time we gather. And today's question is, what about youth culture gives you hope? And so just in honor of consistency, I'll answer those as well. I'm calling in from my favorite town in Maine. I might be a little bit biased because it's where I'm from, but Winter Harbor, Maine, on the Scoodic Peninsula near Acadia. And the thing about youth culture that gives me hope is the pushing of boundaries. One of the things I love about youth work is how they invite curious question asking of the way systems work. And not only it challenges the world around me, but also the way that I do my work. And it's something that consistently pushes my creativity and imagination and desire to explore what's possible. And I'd love to introduce Nina, my co-facilitator today.
Hi everyone, my name is Nina. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm also part of the statewide technical assistance and training team at Mayan. I am calling in from the west end of Portland. And what gives me hope? What about youth culture gives me hope? I think it's just the genuine care that that young people have for each other, even for other young people they don't know or don't see or don't interact with. They just truly care about each other and other young people. And also just want to mention our friend Beth, who also works with Mayan, is hanging out in the chat. So she'll be addressing any questions that come up and we'll be there as well. Thanks. This is going back to you, Gabe.
Thank you so much. So I don't like agendas because I have a way of talking through and around various topics, but here's our conversation guide. Nina and I have this conversation a lot, and each time it shows up, we talk about different things. And so today, I just want to give us a little bit of where we're going. So we're in the framing section today, if you like to have this kind of guide. Then Nina's going to lead us through a deeper dive into social determinants of health and a way she talks about it in terms of community environments. And then we'll dig into how relationships, and more specifically, youth adult partnerships, create a foundation for Mayan's work and the ways that we can do prevention work. And then how do those youth and adult partnerships, how can they be leveraged to shift environmental change while youth are invited to be decision makers in partnership with communities and community decision-making bodies? And then finally, we really wanted to have some young people in the space with us today, but we'll have to settle for Nina and I talking about some of the work we've got to be involved with and witness through our network of young people. And so to start us off, I've talked about relationships, and relationships matter, which is something that was instilled with me growing up in Down East Maine, was so important. The neighbors, the relationships you have with your teachers in the school, and all the ways that the community members look out for us. And I just want to read this from the American Promise Alliance. Supportive relationships, regardless of their source, are highly related to behavioral and emotional engagement and meaningful learning. And so we're going to be talking about relationships a lot. And while we're really important, it's important of what we do with those relationships, because alone they are impactful, but also thinking about how can they help shift environmental change so more young people and more community members have access to meaningful relationships. And Nina, you talk a lot about this, creating an equitable environments. You push me in my thinking and the way that you hold space with young people. Can you talk a little bit more about why this is so important to you and a little bit about what it means when you say environmental change?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Gabe. So I talk about community conditions because we don't exist in a vacuum. We're, like Gabe said, we're all in relationship with each other, with our environments, with the systems that impact us, the systems we navigate, right? Education, healthcare, justice systems. These impact and work on our lives in ways that we might not even see. But a lot of the times, these systems are designed to benefit some at the expense of others. So we have all of these systemic factors that are working on our lives, on our communities, and they create the conditions that we live in, that we experience, even if we can't quite see the thread of like how healthcare leads to what our experience is, our communities are experiencing today. But these community conditions are often called social determinants of health, which is a term you might have heard from the World Health Organization. So these are the conditions in which we live, play, work, and age. And they include economic systems, policies, and social norms. So even if we don't see or notice these things, they impact the resources that are available to us. And they impact how we access different things like healthcare, like education. And Gabe, if you could jump to the next slide, please. We have a little diagram of what are the main social determinants of health. So access to healthcare, this should be access to quality education, economic stability, social and community context, neighborhood and built environment. And social and community context is what we'll mostly be talking about today. That's where a lot of our work lies. So we have these systems, these social determinants that swirl around us. But when these resources are unequally distributed, that's when we see disparities. We have a quote on the next slide that is really helpful. So when there's an unequal distribution of resources that result in poor health outcomes for some, the World Health Organization regards these as disparities. So you might have heard the term health disparities. And they stem from a toxic combination of poor social policies, unfair economic arrangements, and bad politics, right? So it's more about what's happening in the environment and the systems rather than individual choices or individual behaviors. So I went over that really fast, and it seems kind of broad and nebulous. So Gabe, can you help us understand kind of what this looks like in action?
Yeah, thanks so much, Nina. You know, in this world, as I've like worked through public health, I find myself elevating into the stratosphere of the way we talk about things like this. And it, I struggle to conceptualize what this can look like in action, in space, especially in space with young people. And this can be dangerous because I find myself sometimes paralyzed of like, what's the best thing to do, right? Like there are these real challenges. Again, growing up in Down East Maine, I was witness to and had friends and loved ones who were significantly impacted by a lot of challenges that were discussed today throughout the summit, and others as well, including being unhoused. And so when I'm deeply impacted, I come to this work with such a personal perspective and motivation, I can sometimes find myself panicked about what do I do? And then that's the question, like, what do I do next? What do we do next? How do we address this? And I think that's why we're all here is we're trying to address this question of what do we do? Whose responsibility is it to address these systems? And that's why I love the work that I get to do with Mayan because it invites this larger concept. I've been wrestling around with this idea of individual responsibility with collective accountability. And one of the ways we build collective accountability is we have to invite different voices to tables of decision makers and spaces so that we can acknowledge what that looks like. And this image does a great job of what that shifting focus looks like. Instead of putting all of this responsibility on this purple circle in the middle, which you'll recognize the social variation of the social ecological model, we expand the other responsibilities and accountabilities that exist in those other systems so it doesn't all fall on the individual student's social emotional skills, mindset, and academic learning. We put priorities in classroom factors. And so our work is to help build these other spaces. And so we do this through youth adult partnerships. And Jaeger in 2004 produced a paper that boiled down 4 core values to youth adult partnerships that we use in a foundational way in Mayan's work. That's to stand out, to fit in, to measure up, and take hold. And so when I think about standing up in standing out rather in youth spaces, this is that idea of developing identity and the ways that we invite young people to explore who they are. And then who they are in the context of their communities, where they are accepted, loved, where they fit in, but more importantly, belong. And then what are they doing? How are we building spaces for them to achieve, to really explore different ways that they can be successful? And then when they are successful, how does that impact and show the ripple effect? How does it take hold in the community around them? And so our work at Mayan focuses on that direct youth work, where we facilitate youth spaces, and our district partners facilitate youth space like YPAR, which is Youth Participatory Action Research. But then also the rings that center around those individual young people to focus on coaching and supporting the adults who live and exist next to them, like school administrators or teachers, supporting and cultivating resources that expand the way they're able to support not just themselves and their coworkers, but also the environments where young people are existing too. So again, we ran through a lot, but Nina, let's dig into it a little bit more and talk about environmental change. We've discussed Mayan's work as well as what community conditions look like, but I think you got some more about environmental change as it looks in action.
Yeah, so we've talked about kind of how the environment, the context impacts communities, impacts individual young people. And Gabe talked about how youth adult partnerships are so important to start working towards change. But like, what does environmental change mean? And what does it mean for prevention? So when I say environmental change, I really just mean changing the context, changing the environment that we experience, creating space where young people feel seen and heard, they feel like they belong. That's what we're talking about here. And that can be really hard, and that can take a lot of time. It takes a lot of time to build those meaningful movements, but that's what's going to get us past maybe performative strategies of saying that we support young people, but how do we actually live out that value? So I want to introduce the groundwater approach, which was coined by the Racial Equity Institute and is really used to describe equity work. And this is similar to what people call the upstream prevention. But so like imagine there's a pond or a lake and half the fish keep dying. The groundwater approach asks, okay, what's happening in that pond or lake? And also what's happening in the groundwater that feeds into it? Sometimes I feel like the upstream approach or upstream prevention just feels like there are these things that are passing through. They're going down the stream. But the groundwater approach focuses on like people are living in communities. People are living within these contexts. How do you shift that? And how do we do that without, if you have the fish are dying, you're not gonna say, what did that fish do wrong? Or like, what didn't that fish do, right? It's about what was happening in the groundwater, what was happening in the lake or pond. And so if we focus on the context rather than individual behaviors, that's where we address problems. That's when we get down to the root of what's going on. That's when we stop perpetuating harm and we create new possibilities. And in fact, a lot of negative health outcomes actually stem from the trauma and stress of navigating systems. So navigating oppressive or inequitable systems. So when we address that, that takes care of a lot of the trauma and stress and other factors that may lead into outcomes like opioid use or like any type of substance use. So what does that mean, right? This still feels kind of broad and abstract. So I'm going to try to narrow it down a little bit and give a strategy. So we often say, and I hear this phrase a lot, those who are closest to the issue are closest to the solution. So what that means is those who experience something, they know, they hold within them, within the community, they have the knowledge to address that issue. So what does that mean for us who are working in this field? This means authentically engaging in community-driven efforts. So that's not engaging on a surface level. That's not doing it in a tokenizing way. Community-driven work often means giving up control, possibly moving away from evidence-based strategies and addressing the root cause of an issue rather than creating Band-Aid solutions to the work. And in all of these, there's room for engagement with young people. There's room for youth voice. So this requires kind of our own work of, okay, a lot of us, we're experts. We have graduate degrees in these fields. We've been working in this field for years and years. So some of that is our own work to say, okay, I need to give up some control. Because the community that I'm working with, they know what they need. That knowledge is intrinsic in them. and they experience the issue at hand. So I wanted to show the youth engagement continuum. That's the word I was looking for. So hopefully you all can see that. I'll try to explain it if you can. So on the left side, so this is basically just a continuum of how young people can be involved in community-driven efforts, can be involved in making change. So on the far left, I think it says youth services. It's a little small for me too. So that's like individualized services that address individual behaviors. And that's important, right? If a young person is working through substance use, yeah, they need the counseling, they need the healthcare to work through that. But also when we move towards the right of this spectrum, that's when we get more youth buy-in, more youth voice. So there's room for all of these, all parts of the spectrum. We're not saying that you have to be on the far right end of the spectrum. That's really hard and that takes a lot of time. But in the field of trying to address this really big problem of the opioid crisis, we need all of this. We need individual counseling services. We need appropriate healthcare. We need medication assisted treatment. But we also need spaces where young people can really invest in the work, and they are seen as true equal partners in the work. That we're engaging them in a way that values and amplifies their voices in a meaningful way, not just in a way to say like, okay, we did this. And this type of youth work is appropriate and it works with young people. And this might seem counterintuitive if young people are experiencing really big issues, if they're experiencing, if the opioid crisis is, impacting their lives. We address that, you want to address that, but also creating this systemic level change, creating this space where young people are seen and valued. That's where the real work happens, when we have all of that together. But so again, that was a lot. If folks have questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. We'll be taking a look at that as we go through this. But so we talked about youth adult partnerships. We talked about how we need to partner authentically and how we need to work at all levels of the spectrum to really invite young people to take on this challenge with us. But Gabe, you recently ran a youth survey. I'm curious to see to hear what some of these participants said about what they need to start working towards change.
Yeah, Nina, I did. Thanks for bringing that up. So we recently, as Mayan, ran the What About Me Youth Health Survey. And the impetus for this, or the reason behind it, was we were really curious of what did young people see as the future of public health in Maine? Where were the health priorities they saw, and what were the things they were struggling and dealing with now? And so while we're still digging through a lot of qualitative data, which is sometimes difficult to code and pull through, one of the things that really stuck out to me was some of the buckets that were starting to emerge from the feedback that we asked them. One of the questions was asking around how they were defining and looking at health and wellness. How were they defining it by? And the answers were really social, which is unsurprising from a group of adolescents, but it really focused on cultivating more supports for those social systems. That included more access to mental health services, because when they thought of wellness, one of my personal favorites was video games, right? In the ways that some of us might not define it, they were exploring the things that really helped them feel healthy. And that was friends, that was families, but it was also non-familial adults. In fact, one young person, in response to what would help you feel healthier and more well, was someone who I trust outside of my family, or a therapist to talk to. For example, another student or a teacher or someone else. It was clear that a lot of young people were searching for those outlets to engage in conversation, and it wasn't these overwhelming systems. It was really these structures that supported adults to be vulnerable with them, be authentic with them, and be present for them in a way that felt genuine. And I think also this extends itself to this larger bucket of like school, of where they're spending a lot of time, whereas where a lot of young people were sharing a lot of feedback. One young person said, for school to be tailored to how I work as well as others. but I know that's not realistic. And this led to two different things that I saw emerging, was this almost sense of like hopelessness, of concern about not just themselves, but of the peers around them. And I think that's challenging when someone says, this isn't realistic. My vision, my dreams are not realistic. And so that lends itself to a lot of the way systems and young people interact with systems, of how they're able to access some of those resources. And again, coming back to this idea of relationships and youth adult partnerships, there was two quotes that were very blunt and to the point that I really appreciate about young people. And that was, one was, for adults to have actual conversations with us like we're adults. A lot of young people know there's tragedy in the world. They're faced, as we could see from this picture on the screen, that the climate change is real and impacting the future they get to navigate. So they know the realities of a lot of spaces. And when these young people are not engaged as decision makers and problem solvers, or talked to as people, it's really challenging them. And the last one that has been getting to stick with me is people, in response to what do they need, is people that can relate to kids nowadays. A lot of people we are supposed to go to about problems don't even understand them, because they didn't grow up with the internet or facing the same issues in the way that we're raised. And I think that's really important, of not just investing in young people, but understanding the context of the issues they're navigating, and supporting to ourselves to grow in the way that you said, like learn from them. What are your challenges, and how can we shape our supports and system level supports to shift and change that? So those are some of the quotes that I'm pulling out. I'm excited to dig into that further, Nina, and share that back out with folks as we face not just climate change and other challenges, but also issues of the opioid crisis in partnership with young people. And so as we're talking about that, I know you had an example of a youth project you were really excited to share that was rooted in some evidence-based practices, but had some really great results.
Yeah, thank you, Gabe. And I want to go back to that point a little bit about evidence-based programs. And I said earlier that maybe we have to move away from them. And what I mean by that is, when we say evidence-based, what is the evidence? Whose voice is in there? Because another example we're going to talk about is evidence-based. There's research to back it up. We worked with Muskie School, and like the research is there, the evidence is there. But we made sure the evidence was there by making sure the participants of the program, the people that this program impacted, by making sure their voices were included in that, and making sure that the actual program itself was led by the young people who are part of it, and gave them the outcomes that they are looking for and they deem as important. So just something for us all to think about. But I want to talk about an example of celebrating belonging in Wabanaki communities. So if you all aren't familiar with our work, so mine's a statewide team, and we subcontract with different organizations across the state, and they do a lot of the really amazing youth engagement work. So this project was out of Wabanaki Public Health and Wellness. So a group of young people, they wanted to acknowledge and address the harm of social othering, of not feeling like they belong. So a group of Wabanaki youth created a public awareness campaign about the harms of misrepresentation. So they started with their own lived experiences of seeing Indigenous people misrepresented as mascots or hypersexualized in Halloween costumes. And they unpacked how this is a form of dehumanization and how this contributes to a wide range of harms, including missing and murdered Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people, and just Indigenous erasure in colonial or colonized spaces. So they built on their own their own community knowledge of their own lived experiences, and then they gathered data. They participated in they created and disseminated a youth survey to hear what other people are feeling and what kind of education or supports or resources they need. So this data formed the basis of a public education campaign to raise awareness about these issues and to talk about colonialism. At the same time, these young people recognize the need to be in spaces where they belong, where they don't have to explain themselves. I put a couple quotes on this slide that were really, really stuck out to me. One was, it's always having to explain why we do what we do when it's intersected with ceremony, when we know that it works. That's the evidence I'm talking about. In their community, they know this works. They've been doing it for generations and generations, and it works. And it might not be in the evidence base that we are used to, but it's real. And as someone who is looking at this community or maybe isn't part of it, you just have to believe it, right? Because that's their lived experience, that's their truth. And they said another quote, we tend to mind, body, and spirit. That's how we know how to heal. So I just wanted to pull those out as just lifting up this community knowledge. But going back to what I was saying, these young people, they knew they needed a space where they belonged and where they didn't have to explain what they do. They didn't have to explain why ceremony means so much to them because they all know. So the Micmac Youth Council took the lead to organize and host a gathering, and I think about 200 Wabanaki community members showed up. They did their drumming, dancing. There was food donated by local Wabanaki farmers and fisher people. Is that how you say it? Fisher people? Anyways, Wabanaki young leaders, they recognize the importance of belonging. And through all of this work, they really strengthened intergenerational connectedness and ceremony, which is so central to their experiences and their culture. Gabe, can you tell us about another example?
I would love to, and you started it too, and you're giving us some good foundation for that. And thanks for sharing those experiences of those young people for us, Nina. The second one we wanted to talk to was Gateway to Opportunity, which is a summer youth employment program that Mayan helps support as the logistic body and coordinating body of the program. This program has been around for several years, again out of the Muskie School, and was coordinated by Goodwill. And recently, we've stepped in to help coordinate it. And so this year, July 6th is when we kicked off this year's G2O event, which was so much fun. And I felt really honored to be connected with. And the way the program works is we have host sites from across the state, which are organizations that have a project they've been wanting to complete. And they apply as a host site to hire a group of young people to lead that project. And so that group of young people will work as employees of that organization to achieve this job. And we also hire a group of teen leaders who the regular participants are high schoolers, and the teen leader will be slightly older, oftentimes recently graduated from high school or in college. And they will help facilitate that group project. They will be kind of like a supervisor of the project in partnership with those house sites. So we've created these ladders of leadership, or the program has built these ladders of leadership to support the development of youth skills. And we also in this program also do every Thursday, they do a career workshop where we've invited business leaders from across the state to run workshops where we cultivate specific skills for the youth participants. And those can be resume writing, interviewing, as well as navigating personal finance or financial systems in case someone was interested in entrepreneurship. And so this program, one example of it is at Healthy Acadia in Machias, and they have an annual Down East Teen Leadership Camp. And this program has been running for almost 20 years, and they've been wanting to shift it up, change it up, and have young people inform the way that this camp happens. And so that's what they're doing this year as part of their G2O project. Is they have their team leader, their host site, and this group of young people. I'm presenting at it actually as a workshop. So I was just interviewed by two young people while my workshop should show up at this camp. And I had to justify to them, and they constructed their questions and interviewed me. And so it was really cool to see that process happen. Another example or host site this year is the city of Portland. Their commercial tobacco prevention team wanted to engage young people and hire young people to do a media project on commercial tobacco prevention. And so they are hosting another G2O program. the significance of this G2O and youth employment generally is so important, because part of what my coworker Alistair and I were talking about is it's not just about young people being paid to do good work. It's also about how do organizations shift their culture so that young people are more want to work with them and work for them and in partnership with them. And this is something that really that communities can struggle with. I was supporting a youth group in Machias, and we were talking about running a community event. Like, what do we need to feel like, wanted here? And after a moment of silence, one of the young people just kind of raised their head, and they said, Gabe, I really care about my community. I don't feel like they care about me. And that was devastating, because when I think about the rates at which young people are leaving, how do we create an infrastructure where they want to stay? And so Gateway to Opportunity is an evidence-based system that shows when organizations shift their culture to accommodate and invite youth employees, it's beneficial for everybody. And it creates an economic system that's supportive of longevity, which we really need in a lot of the rural spaces like where I grew up. Because I know I was destined to want to leave, and realizing the beauty of what we can do if we work with young people to shift those systems to accommodate and create more opportunities. We're approaching our last minutes together, and we have one last thing we want to talk about. But before we get to that, we want to invite you all to stay in touch. Here is my email, Nina's email. Subscribe to our newsletter, and you can find one of those district partners that Nina mentioned on our website to get in contact with your local district youth coordinator. We talked about a lot here, and we want to acknowledge this is a continual skill and journey for both Nina and I, as we have this conversation almost every day next to each other, right? Like, I'm constant, Nina, what do you think about this? So be in touch with us, have that conversation with us and your district partners as we explore what does authentic youth engagement really look like, and how can that shift systems to better help. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, Nina, to come back and look at you. I know we can't see the folks in the room, but we want you to open up that chat again, because we're going to invite you to share another idea, from your perspective, another idea. And before we get there, I want to bring us back to this idea of accountability. So Beth, our fearless leader, invited us to read this article about accountability. And in it, there's this quote from Mia Mingus that says, "We need to move away from holding people accountable and instead work to support people to proactively take about accountability for themselves." And as I was like wrestling with this, I was like really thinking about this, Nina, of like, it's not my job to hold you accountable, but rather how do we can create these systems and these structures that support people to be accountable for themselves? And part of what this is addressing the fear. And so, folks, what we're asking here today, and what we continually try to do, is we want that radical hope, that relentless hope in the face of that fear. We're all brought to this work in the face of those challenges and issues that stem from real fear, reasonable fear. So what do we do about it? And that's where we want to invite you to rejoin us in this conversation. What do you do next? What is your next step in addressing that fear, of leaning into radical hope, in order to invite young people to the table and address the challenges facing our community? Nina, I'm putting you on the spot. What are you doing next? What's your act of radical hope?
This is something I've been thinking about a lot. And you mentioned it too earlier, Gabe, of just like the not knowing what to do and like almost being paralyzed. Like, this is a big issue. Help. I think what I'm going to do next is just acknowledge the fear and just do it anyways. Just do something. This is a real life example that happened to me the other day. I was driving and I saw someone laying in the park, and I was like, is that person okay? And then I was like, you know what? There's other people there. They're probably fine. And then like I was thinking about it. I was like, but what if everybody else was thinking that, right? And so in the future, what I want to do next, what I'm committing to, is holding myself accountable to live out the values that I talked about here. So that's what I'm thinking about. Do we have any thoughts in the chat yet? No rush, but just wondering.
Yeah, while we do that, I'll talk about what I want to do next,
Yeah.
Nina, because one of the things for me, like that radical hope comes from is doing self-exploration, which includes self-care, but not always like a bubble bath or a bag of French fries, which it can be. A bag of French fries, a basket of French fries, from my favorite takeout. Now I'm just getting off track with French fries, but is to really invest in my own learning, my own education, and the ways that I show up in this space where I think I want to be helping, right? And I try to help, but sometimes I have a big personality and I can steamroll those communities or those voices that need to be heard. And so part of that for me, which is really hard, is not talking, taking a step back and listening. And part of that is searching out those spaces where I can engage with the folks who have that lived experience where I need to learn more. And again, that process is really scary because part of that is admitting that I don't know what to do. And like you said so eloquently earlier today, is like giving up the control, which is so hard. Is so hard, especially when I'm governed by fear that I'll lose another loved one, or that systems aren't going to adequately support close family members. And so acting in face of that fear, and as Beth has been saying, being a hound dog for that fear, I think is my next step.
Yeah, I want to throw out a quick question. I think we just have a couple of minutes, but Miriam Kaba says hope is a discipline. Gabe was asking us for hope, and that's a practice we need to build. So how do you build that practice of having that radical, relentless hope? I don't know if I have an answer for that. I think it's listening and trust. I think trust is a big thing. Trusting that young people know what's good for them, because they do, and trusting that they'll ask for help. And always learning and reading. That's something that always helps me.
Trust is such a good one, Nina. I struggle with that sometimes too, especially like when I'm facilitating a youth group and it's like, all right, we want pizza every day for lunch or something. Not that that really happens, but it does. Like I was in this youth group that was obsessed with bacon, and I was just like, bacon again? Really? This is the third day we're gonna say bacon for lunch? All right. But like trusting that process of like, all right, if I can sit here and talk about bacon, we can explore the deeper conversations that we want to have. So trust is a really good one. And I think coming back to that idea of discipline, and hope is discipline of really committing to myself the areas I don't want to practice too. So the areas that I'm not as good at. So like racial equity in the past year has been a huge area for me to build my knowledge and my skills around facilitating, because I used to like really avoid that conversation with young people, and now wading into it and saying, yeah, this is a big issue for you folks, like what are you thinking, and then being able to join them in that conversation, which terrified me, and now is a really important place. We had some other comments show up. Nina, we had Joanne say her work is to be quick to listen. Yeah, thanks, Joanne. And Michael said listening to youth. Yeah, how does listening to youth show up for you, Nina, in this space where you're really committed to systems change?
Yeah. So I think often listening is so important, right? But when we're in relationship with young people, it has to be that mutual relationship. So yes, listening absolutely is the place to start. So that's when we create space where young people feel like they belong, they feel like they can contribute. But also, how do we translate that listening into action? So it's listening to what young people need from us and actually making that happen, and not losing ourselves in the work. I think when we talk about listening, when we talk about amplifying youth voice, we're also in there in the process, right? We're supporting them. We have a stake. And any type of social movement, we all have a stake because this is our world too. So it's about listening to young people, but also acknowledging where you are in the process. And like Dave said, like acknowledge where you want to learn more or where you need to challenge yourself. Was that an answer?
I love it, and I think it leverages something that our coworker Izan says is, she supports one of the programs called the Young People's Caucus, where young people go and talk to legislators in Augusta, and She says, oftentimes these young people say, we're tired of being listened to. Do something about it, right? We can't just keep standing here and telling you our story and nothing changes. So that listening, right? That, like we talk about, like active listening, is saying, thanks for sharing that. What do you want me to do with that? How do I use that to transition and make change so that it benefits the system? Another comment I wanted to bring out in chat was, hope is what I've got, right? Like that, I think that's real important right now in the state of things. And some of the things we look at is without hope, without those like dreams and that vision, things can feel pretty barren. And so really leaning in and supporting of like, and building off of that hope, giving that hope some spark and direction. And part of that is like inviting young people. One of the first things I say is like, what do you love to do? Like, what's the thing you enjoy? And oftentimes I'll hear play Minecraft, Roblox. Great. Like that's a place to start. If you love Minecraft, let's talk about that and explore how does that help you make change?
Yeah, and one last thing that I'll stop talking, that reminds me, that helps me keep on hope, is, so we talked a lot about structural things, systemic things that have this negative impact, but also focusing on the good, focusing on the positive protective factors that's inherent in youth culture. Like I said earlier, the way they care about each other, the way that they take chances, the way that they really have the desire to make change. Like that gives me hope. And young people aren't giving up. So why should we? Like we can have hope together.
Nina, I can't top that. So we're gonna stop there. We heard a dream team was in chat. Hey folks, our team is always expanding, so we hope that you'll join us. I'll share my screen once again so we can you can join us at any point here on our emails. Subscribe to the Mayan newsletter. Join us for these conversations. Really and truly, that's an open invitation because we want to challenge the way we do our work too, and to do that we need more members of the team. So thank you folks so much. Any last words, Nina?
No, I think we said it all. But thank you all so much. It's really wonderful to be in space with you all, even if I can't see your faces. Hope I can one day soon. And please do keep in touch. We love having conversations, seeing what's happening out in the state. So looking forward to hearing from you all.
Thank you, folks.